not the original Eldridge area relative or descendant, but I am a recovering gerrymanderer. I have for many years represented political parties and candidates and done lots of redistricting, which is the polite word for gerrymandering, and I'm now in rehab, in cold turkey, and I'm now into redistricting reform. I actually, I was thinking, and I see so many of my wonderful colleagues who have been in the trenches with me over the years, but I see that the last time I was in North Carolina in connection with a gerrymandering case was when I argued Shaw v. Reno, which was back in 1992 or 3. And I represented Jan Reno because I was in the Justice Department back then. We got her dismissed from the lawsuit, and then they appealed, and it still became Shaw v. Reno in the U.S. Supreme Court. But I welcome you. I understand yesterday was a day of substantive discussion, and there was an occasional reference to things like the mean median difference and T-sign and efficiency gaps, and today we're going to go into the weeds on that and spend a lot of time on the statistical part of it. And so I'm now at the Campaign Legal Center as Director of Voting Rights and Redistricting, where I've been since 2004. Ruth Greenwood, who you met yesterday as Deputy in Redistricting, there she is back there. And I also, with Ruth and Nick Stephanopoulos, and Dr. Simon Jackman, who was our expert witness in Whitford, and Bill Whitford, the plaintiff, is here, and I was proud to represent him in that case and go to trial. Oh, there's Annabelle, right, Annabelle Harless, and my other colleague at the Campaign Legal Center, who was part of the legal team. So we have a lot invested. We are on our way to the Supreme Court, as you probably heard in the Whitford case. We expect the Supreme Court to take the case. They normally take decisions where a plan has been held unconstitutional. So, as this one was, first time in 30 years. So we are very excited about the opportunity. And the only thing I will say about how important partisan gerrymandering is, and what we're about to hear today about all the various measures, is this, that the opportunity to get the Supreme Court to rule on a partisan gerrymandering claim under the Constitution, that window is probably open for the last time in this case. We think we have possibly 5 votes now on the court to do this. And if we don't, if we're unsuccessful in it, my fear is that if Justice Kennedy leaves, who's a big, strong supporter of First Amendment claims and First Amendment rights, we may have that window closed for the rest of our lifetimes. So there's a lot at stake. And we are going to do everything we can, along with the help of many people in this room, to put as many arguments before the court about how this undemocratic principle of gerrymandering, something which turns democracy on its head and lets politicians cherry-pick their voters and eliminate their potential challengers by putting their challengers in a different district, and minimizing the voting strength and the voices of their political opponents. We think we actually have a shot, and we've got the best record we could put together to go up to the Supreme Court. So I'm counting on the Rick Phillis's and the Anita Earls and all the others who are masterful at writing arguments and briefs to make the case with us when we get to the Supreme Court. And I just wanted to welcome you on behalf of not only Common Cause, our partner organization, and the Campaign Legal Center. Thank you very much for being here and showing your interest in this important topic.
So, Kathy, do I use this? Is this working, or do I need to use that?
Me?
No, do I use this?
Yes.
Okay, so I can just talk like this. Okay.
Yes.
Hopefully everyone can hear me. So, welcome to our first panel today. It's great to see everyone back again early in the morning on a Friday for this. One of the rituals of being a moderator at an event like this is that you get to stand up and read the illustrious bios of all of the speakers. But Nick and I were at a redistricting conference a couple of weeks ago, and Pam Carlin from Stanford was moderating a panel, and she said, you know, I'm not going to read the bios, they're in the materials, you can read them for yourselves. And in the interest of time and making sure we have enough time for questions, because these are going to be fascinating presentations, I'm going to adopt the Carlin rule. But suffice it to say that all of our presenters are bigly people, and they are doing really amazing things. And trust me, you are going to be very, very impressed by all of them. One programming note, I do apologize. We were expecting Frederick Douglass to be on the panel, but he's available. But Nick assures me that he has spoken with Frederick and will be presenting his views on the subject. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Simon Jackman from the University of Sydney, who is also involved in the Whitford case. And Simon is going to talk to us about the causes of efficiency gaps and the arguments that sometimes you get that things like geography or compliance with the Voting Rights Act actually are the drivers of those asymmetries and not partisan intent and motive. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Simon. I will say...
Sorry, we're going to use the microphone after all.
We are going to use the microphone. Okay. So we are going to use the microphone. It's better. I will say, looking around, I think my panel, whatever else you can say about them, I think they have the best shoes of any panel. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Simon.
Still very fashionable.
So Simon persuaded the judges in Whitford.
Big league, good shoes. Good morning. I will talk about the efficiency gap in congressional elections over the last 44 years. I'll presume that most people in the room don't know what the efficiency gap is. This is a concept that Eric McGee and there's Eric, is really his baby, and then he and Nick really took this and ran with it in a law review piece, and then I came through and had the great honor and privilege of working on the Whitford case, where my report in that case really looked at the properties of the efficiency gap in state legislative elections, and with a special emphasis on Wisconsin. But what we've done in the last couple of months is this focus on North Carolina, and indeed to put North Carolina in some context, it's a congressional plan. I've done this analysis of efficiency gaps in redistricting plans spanning a large number of American states over many years. So the data I'm going to talk about spanned 512 congressional elections, and what I mean when I use the term congressional election, I mean a congressional election in a state. So we haven't got 512 years, obviously, but we've got states by years get us up to 512. Those 512 state-level congressional elections span 136 plans and 25 states. So the analysis is restricted to states with 7 or more congressional districts. So once we get down to a very small number of congressional districts, line drawing gets a little lumpy, and the measures we use to characterize a plan in turn get a little lumpy and a little unreliable, actually. In the background, I won't talk about this today, are these imputations that you've got to do for when you've got uncontested seats. That makes what is otherwise, frankly, the efficiency gap an extremely simple tool, and I think that's part of its utility, is its simplicity. But there is one complicating factor in the background, and that's how you handle these uncontested seats. They are quite ubiquitous at the state level, in state legislative districts. They're a real problem. Not quite so at the congressional level, but still a fair amount of them to worry about. Anyway, at the end of all that, we get 512 of these things called efficiency gap scores, one for each election. So what is an efficiency gap? It's an attempt to take down the whole distribution of seat shares recorded district by district in a given election in a given state, and reduce that to a single number, to an index that you can then say a low number means something, a high number means something. And so an efficiency gap, 0 is neutral, meaning that one party has no efficiency gap with respect, advantage with respect to the other. There is no gap. The gap here refers to a difference between the parties. And what is efficiency? Efficiency speaks to this property that's in electoral systems. What does an electoral system do? What does a district system do? It is a mapping of votes on the ground into seats in the legislature. Right? That's what it does. A district system groups people together, right, and takes their votes, and whoever gets the most votes in that particular entity we've created, a district, that person gets to go to Congress or to the state legislature. And to be efficient in doing that means that your statewide vote share, whatever it might be, you've got that spread out through districts, and this is the property of the district lines now of the plan. You've got that done in a way such that you're not wasting a lot of votes. You're translating your support on the ground into seats quite efficiently. An inefficient way of doing that is something that a gerrymander does. Right? Gerrymanders create inefficiencies in the mapping of votes into seats by packing, right? Meaning you are winning seats by way more than you ought to be. If the goal is to win the seat, remember, you win the seat when you get one more vote than the other, the plurality winner, right? And in a very strict technical sense, any votes beyond that are wasted, right? And moreover, any votes you cast, right, for a losing candidate, votes cast for losing candidates, they're wasted votes too, because they didn't translate into seats. And so what I've done here is just take the last North Carolina election. There were no uncontested seats in any of the 13 districts in North Carolina's congressional election in 2016. And it's a very simple accounting exercise. It is nothing other than something you could do in an Excel spreadsheet. You don't need a PhD in anything to do this. With that definition of wasted votes, you count up the wasted votes for the Democrats. You count up the wasted votes for the Republicans. You're always wasting votes, right? If you win the seat, you're wasting votes. If you lose the seat, you're wasting votes. You're just wasting them in different ways. But the point is that symmetric? Right? And if one side is wasting more votes than the others, relatively speaking, then we've got what's called an efficiency gap. And the way this is normed, an efficiency gap where the wasted vote rates offset one another, you'd have an efficiency gap of 0. Here, an efficiency gap of negative 0.19. That's a profound disadvantage for Democratic candidates because, as you can see here, there's about 1.6 wasted Democratic votes and only 700,000 wasted Republican votes. You take the difference of those two, divide by the total number of votes cast, and that's that's the mechanics of computing this thing. Note that there's no modeling, there's no statistics, it's literally just counting. Hey, Justice Kennedy, it's just counting. We're not imagining some election where someone got 50% or the incumbents all had red hair or whatever, right? It's just, we take the election that we had and you do that arithmetic exercise.
Quick question, how about third-party candidates and write-ins? How do they factor?
You can include those in the mix, although typically everything goes a lot. This is premised largely on a two-party view of the world, right? Although it's not impossible, right? You can just define wasted votes being, if you win, it's just the plurality win, isn't it? You don't have to be a majority winner, right? And we could define wasted votes for third parties or others, just that all of their votes are wasted. If they don't win any seats, right?
Ask that question in my presentation. I got an answer.
Okay.
Okay. Can we do questions at the end? Is that all right?
Sorry.
Yeah. These are the efficiency gaps when you average them by a redistricting plan across that 150 odd plans I talked about. How many? 136 plans. This is stacking them all from most disadvantageous to Democrats. That's what negative numbers mean. to the most advantageous to Democrats. That's what positive numbers means. Positive numbers mean. And 0 is neutral and on balance. So each one, and so I've just sorted them from low to high. And so they roughly, on average, you get roughly over that much American history, political history, that many states. Essentially, 0 is what you tend to get on average. But the point is, North Carolina's plan from 2012 is the worst in my analysis of 136 plans, and the plan that was in place for 2016, a stepchild of the 2012-2014 plan, is the 4th worst out of 136 plans used in 44 years of redistricting in 25 years, and that's a handy thing to show judges, which we hope to do so soon.
What are the error bars?
The error bars reflect uncertainty stemming from imputations for missing this. And in some cases they're large, but typically not too large. There's the trajectory of efficiency gap scores for every state over the time period. And I've highlighted North Carolina with a dark line to show its trajectory. And you can see that something happened around about 2010. And again, what's North Carolina is such a telling case. Again, it's not like you need a PhD in anything really to sort of make that point. That passes what we call the interocular test, pretty convincingly. You'll see though, just if you look at the lines carefully enough, North Carolina was not the only state to take a big dive in that negative pro-Republican direction with its efficiency gap scores in the 2010 and the redistricting following the 2010 census. We'll say a little bit about that now. This is another summary of all the efficiency gap scores. This breaks out efficiency gap scores by decade and by who controlled the redistricting in a state for that decade. And the story here is that there really isn't, and the decades go, they're hard to see, but the decades run 70s, 80s, 90s, 00s, and what we've got so far in the teens. And the 3 boxes go Democratic, other, Republican. Other means the redistricting was controlled by a court or a non-partisan commission. And you can see that prior to the 2000s, really, there isn't much to distinguish among efficiency gaps by who controlled the redistricting. What starts to happen is partisan control starts to really matter in the decade of the 00s, and then in the current decade that we're in. And in particular, we see this gap. So now, if Democrats control redistricting, they're more likely to implement plans that have efficiency gaps consistent with Democratic advantage. And if Republicans control the redistricting, they're instituting plans that favour them. And as you expect, these plans are being drawn by other bodies, courts, commissions, roughly in the middle, and centered pretty close to 0, down biased, neutral position. This shows what's happened with partisan control of redistricting, and the red line is the one that's kind of interesting, and that big takeoff in it, that's a proportion of plans that have been controlled by Republicans, and that's gone up from 0 in my analysis up to over half now of the current plans out there were drawn under Republican control, and the analog of that has to be that the other control categories have to go down, and Democratic control now is down barely above 10%. That's one of the things that happens. State legislatures themselves being gerrymandered, handing partisan control of congressional redistricting into partisan hands. This is these are regression estimates, and for a non-technical audience, these won't make a lot of sense. Well, what these are we're estimating the effect of moving from neutral or independent court or commission control of redistricting to partisan control of redistricting. What happens to the efficiency gap on average? And I've done it for different time periods. The big story here is that over the long run, that's the bottom of the table, over the full 44-year period, there's no statistically significant effect associated with Democratic control, but there barely is an effect associated with Republican control. The effects, as those previous charts suggested, are really concentrated in recent decades. Partisan control of redistricting is something that really started to appear and make its mark in recent decades. So you're getting larger and statistically significant effects associated with who controlled redistricting in decades, 90s into the 00s into the 10s. And I'll skip that because I'm out of time. And finally, what this does is to investigate. Suppose that the rate at which Republicans controlled redistricting plans didn't change, stayed as it was back in the 90s, which was virtually zero. Right? What would the efficiency gap distribution look like today if there hadn't been this surge in Republican control of redistricting plans? And what the red line does is chart the actual history, what's actually happened to the distribution of efficiency gap scores by decade, and it's gone from being close to zero, perhaps a tiny hint of a Democratic advantage back in the 70s, and this sharp trend towards, on average, this is averaging over the entire country, evidence of Republican advantage in congressional redistricting. If not for Republican control of the redistricting process, we would have got those teal-coloured lines, those blue-coloured lines, and we'd essentially have, our best guess is, we'd be back to essentially line ball. On average, we'd have plans that were right around the zero line. There'd be some states that had pro-democratic advantage and some states that had pro-Republican advantage. But on average, if Republicans weren't controlling as much redistricting as they do now, we'd be back at somewhere close to where that blue line is. So there's some evidence about what the efficiency gap is, how easy it is to compute, and the fact that we've got pretty good evidence to suggest that partisan control of redistricting has been a big driver as to how we're getting the scores that we're getting. And moreover, I also showed you just how egregious the North Carolina situation is at the moment, and looking forward to getting that in front of some judges pretty soon.
So next we're going to have Chris Sasanovich from the UCLA, who's going to talk to us about the impact of partisan bias and these large asymmetries on the quality of representation. And this is brand new research, so he's here to present.
Thanks a lot, Michael. It's not every day that the academics beat the lawyers in terms of shoes, so relish that a little bit. Although it's really all thanks to Simon. So I'm Chris Sasanovich, and along with my colleague at MIT, Chris Warshaw, we spent a lot of time studying public opinion, large data sets of public opinion, large data sets of voting in legislatures, including the United States Congress and state legislators, policy even at the city level. And so we're really scholars of representation. We want to understand the difference, sort of the relationship between what people want in some sense and what they're getting from government. And so it's very natural to study that in the context of something like the efficiency gap, where we might think that there are real effects not only on just the number of seats that a party has, but on actual outcomes. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So by definition, when you have an efficiency gap, what you have is, in some sense of the word, overrepresentation of seats for one party. That is, because of this asymmetry and wasted votes, one party is getting more seats than it otherwise would. And for the folks in this room, it probably makes a lot of sense to make the argument that that's going to have an effect on policy and on how the kind of pivotal members of these legislators are actually ending up voting. Especially today, where we have very polarized parties, where the parties have very different platforms, it's natural for us to think that if the bad guys win, because they are getting too many seats, or if they get more seats, that's going to have bad effects. But it wasn't always the case that the parties were as polarized as they are today. And you often see something happening in state politics that now we're seeing to some degree at the national level. That is, one party's campaigns on a certain platform, then they get into power and they say, gee, repealing the Affordable Care Act, maybe that's not actually what people want. And so maybe we're going to sort of scale back that idea. And at the state level in particular, there's this notion of more comedy, more competition for the center historically. And so there are reasons to think that you might not have as big policy differences as you might think. It's also not necessarily the case that as you expand the number of seats for a particular party, you're going to change the sort of average of how people are voting and what sort of policies get passed in a more extreme direction. It really matters who it is that is filling these additional seats. So we might think of competitive seats, and the people that are winning by these narrower margins are more moderate. And it's also the case at the state level that there are a lot of barriers to translating seats into policy. Lots of states have supermajority requirements that make it very hard to pass new laws and alter budgets. I'm coming from the state of California right now, which is particularly bad in the sense of needing large supermajorities to actually govern. And so there are reasons to think that increases in seats do not automatically translate into increases in policy. And so what we're doing here is bringing a few really exciting, interesting data sets to this question of what the actual impact of efficiency gaps is on the composition of legislatures and on policy at the state level. And so a starting place is this excellent data set that Simon has put together on efficiency gaps from 1972 to 2014 that he just told you about. And so we have those for lots and lots of states. We also have them for lots of congressional elections and so on. Another really useful data set for answering these sorts of questions is data that we have from 1993 to 2014 that has thousands of roll call votes in all of these state legislatures. And so we can actually look at summaries of to what degree state legislators are voting in a conservative manner or voting in a liberal manner across all of these different state legislatures. Happy to talk more about that if folks are interested, but it turns out that just giving somebody sort of a liberal or conservative score on their roll call voting characterizes a large number of issues that they vote on. And so this is just going to be a simple score for each legislator, how liberal or conservative your voting record is, and that really tells us a lot about a lot of different issues that they're deciding. And then finally, the ultimate effect that we might be interested in is how these states are changing their policies. And thanks to my co-author, we have this amazing data set starting in 1936 on 150 different policies that all of these states have enacted. We've got policies that are sort of binary choices on whether or not places have school voucher programs or something like that. We've got tax policy on what rates are and what budgets are, and a whole variety of policies. In the same way, we're just going to summarize this large set of policies with a very, very simple score for every state that characterizes whether you fall on the liberal side or the conservative side of the spectrum in terms of the type of policies that state has enacted. And so this allows us to examine the relationship between these things. And so when we're thinking about what that looks like, it's natural to think about seats and the degree to which seats drive legislative voting and drive policy. But we might also think in terms of the efficiency gap, what we're really thinking about is those seats that you're getting because of the way that you're drawing districts and packing and cracking these districts. So we can think about what would these seat shares look like if efficiency gaps were zero, that is equal no asymmetries in terms of wasted votes. And because the efficiency gap is so simple, it's very easy to take Simon's data and say, well, we know what the seats and the votes were, and we know what the efficiency gap is. Let's assume that instead of having the efficiency gap a particular place has, let's just say that it has the number of seats that would give it a zero efficiency gap. And how different is that? Simon was just talking quite a bit about that. What you see here, each of these points is a different plan. The line there is a line. You would be on this line for a particular plan if the actual seat share you had was the same as the seat share that you would have if you have a zero efficiency gap. That is, if you had the number of seats that corresponds with a no asymmetry in wasted votes. And you can see, I think I've got Wisconsin is right there, way far from this central line where the points should be. And these dashed lines are this 7% efficiency gap bound that Simon has shown. If you're beyond that bound, you have a very persistent and bad efficiency gap. And so we've got a lot of places where these seats are far off from what they would be if there were no asymmetries in wasted votes. What we can do is we can look at the voting of median assembly members across these state assemblies. So folks in this room are very used to thinking about the importance of 50% plus one in the electoral setting. In a legislature, 50% plus one can also be very important. That's what you need to get to a majority. And so the median legislator is the person who has an equal number of legislators to their right and to their left. And so they're going to be pivotal in getting to 50% plus one. And so they're going to be a policymaker who's incredibly important for the types of policy that you get, and also for the types of things that states are thinking about. You've got to think about policy that can appeal to that median legislator in order to win, and that really shapes sort of the political dialogues of states. And so what we have here is the Democratic seat share in a state legislature, and we've simply graphed the conservatism of the median member of the assembly on that Democratic seat share. And what you see is, of course, is that as you get more Democrats, these assemblies get less conservative. Okay, and so this is a simple scatter plot that suggests that actually, yes, these seat shares do matter in terms of the type of policy that you're getting, or at least the type of legislators that you're getting in these legislatures. But we also know that there are other things that drive how conservative these legislatures are. And so, for instance, I've just highlighted the set of states that are in the Southeast. What we know about states in the South is that a lot of the Democratic Party organizations for a lot of this time period were quite different in the South than in the North. And so you have a set of parties that are much more conservative than what we would think of today as maybe what the Democratic Party stands for. And so that's one feature that's sort of driving the type of legislators we're getting that is not really related to, or at least is not the same as seats. And so if we really want to understand this, we have to account for some of these other things that drive the kinds of legislators that you get that are not just the share of seats that you have unfairly gotten by districting. And so what we do here is we account statistically for differences between states, differences between different time periods, We account for what policy was in previous states of the world, and so, for instance, how much you're going to change policy is going to depend on what your current policy is as a state. And we're also going to account for the fact that there's this other very important elected official who is in the form of the governor. And what we find is that efficiency gaps, even accounting for all of these things, have pretty large effects. And so as you get more of a pro-democratic efficiency gap that is going this way, you also get a more liberal median member of your legislature. So that's going down in this direction. And in fact, as we go from sort of a 10-point efficiency gap in the liberal direction, from a 10-point efficiency gap in the conservative direction, we get very, very big differences in legislatures stemming from differences in party control. But even within parties, we see that changing seat shares have an effect. And perhaps more importantly, we also find a relatively big effect. We've reversed the direction here, so that's a little bit confusing. Now up is liberal, but this is basically the same as the last graph that you saw, except here what you're seeing is an effect on policy. And what we find is that a change of about 5 points in the efficiency gap has as big an effect on policy as a change in the party of the governor. And so we're talking about, now historically speaking, these policy changes are not large relative to the sort of policy change you get in a state over the course of that state's history, because states have very different trajectories. Nonetheless, a sizable policy change that's actually that can be attributed to seats, and of course seats are the main thing that the efficiency gap is changing here. Thanks.
Over to the man of the hour in many ways. It's, well, at least this hour, but the whole conference really. Nick Stephanopoulos, who's going to talk to us both about the causes and the consequences of efficiency gaps focused on Congress.
Great, thank you, Michael, and thanks to everyone who's come to this conference. It's great to be with so many friends here. I'm going to say also, speaking of Simon, that I think our biggest secret weapon in trial was not Simon's analysis or his brain or his credentials. It really were his boots that he wore every day to trial. I highly recommend Simon as an expert witness for exactly that reason. The style will win you the hearts and minds of the judges. So like Chris and Simon, I'm going to be discussing the causes and the consequences of partisan gerrymandering. Unlike Simon's analysis, I'm going to be looking at a broader set of factors that can potentially drive asymmetries. And unlike Chris's presentation, I'll be looking at distorted representation at the congressional level, not at the state legislative level. And I've got to say, in my view, I think this analysis that we're starting to get into in this panel is the next big empirical frontier in the study of gerrymandering. So, thanks to Eric's work, thanks to past generations of scholars like Andy Gelman and Gary King, we know a lot already about how to measure partisan gerrymandering. We have good metrics that tell us the extent of gerrymandering in a given state and in a given year. What we don't know nearly as much about is what are the drivers of gerrymandering? Why do we observe small or large partisan asymmetries in different states and different times? We also don't know very much about the consequences of gerrymandering. Does gerrymandering, as we all may suspect, actually distort representation or actual policy outcomes in the state level or the federal level? We don't really know, but these are very, very important questions. So if, for example, large partisan asymmetries were not due to the intentional manipulation of district lines, then we might worry a lot less about those large asymmetries. And on the other hand, if large asymmetries do lead to skewed representation or policy outcomes that don't reflect the will of the people, we might become even more concerned than we already are about the extent and the severity of gerrymandering. So these are really significant issues for us to tackle. Okay, so I'm going to first talk about some of the potential causes of partisan gerrymandering. And I'm going to lump these causes into 4 sets of hypotheses. So the first hypothesis, and the most intuitive, and the one that Simon addressed, is that the institution responsible for redistricting makes a difference for the size of gerrymandering that we observe. So we might obviously think that when Democrats are in control of redistricting, we see large pro-democratic efficiency gaps, and vice versa for Republicans. And we might also think that when some nonpartisan institution is responsible for redistricting, like a commission or a court, or when government is divided between the two parties, then we might not expect to see as large efficiency gaps, or at least efficiency gaps that don't benefit either party consistently. A second set of hypotheses involve minority representation. So there's an argument that dates back to the 1990s that as we draw more majority-minority districts, we might therefore be skewing the plan as a whole in a Republican direction. The logic here is that majority-minority districts tend to be districts that are very, very safe for Democrats. So they're districts where the Democratic candidate wins by an overwhelming margin. So if that's right, we might be concerned that packing the Democrats in those districts skews the map in total in a Republican direction. But we can investigate this empirically instead of just speculating about the effect. I'll just mention one more hypothesis. I'll skip the fourth one. But a third hypothesis might be that political geography affects the direction and the size of gerrymandering. So there's an argument that in more urbanized states, Democrats tend to waste a lot of votes because they're naturally clustered in the urban areas. And maybe Republicans are more efficiently spread out across suburban or exurban areas. And conversely, maybe Democrats do better in more rural states because there the Democratic vote isn't as over-concentrated in a big city. Okay, so how do we actually analyze these different hypotheses? So I use Simon's data set at the congressional level, about 500 congressional elections in 25 states over a 44-year period. So to analyze the effect of the institution that's responsible for redistricting, I use a technique called near neighbor matching. All this means is looking for states that are very similar across a range of variables. So the overall electoral environment, the African American and Latino population and seat shares, the level of urbanization, but then to find states that are similar along all of those dimensions, but that are different in terms of what institution was responsible for redistricting. So the idea is that we're simulating a natural experiment. We have states that are identical, except that in one state, Democrats were in control of redistricting. And in a different state, Republicans were in control. And we can figure out what the impact of that treatment is on the size of gerrymandering that we observe. This technique, the near neighbor matching, only really works for binary variables, like which institution is responsible for redistricting. So for all of the other variables that I'm looking at, the continuous variables, like the Black and Latino seat shares, the level of urbanization in a state, for those variables, I just use a conventional regression with fixed effects for states and years. So let's start with the results of the near neighbor matching. So this again is trying to show us what is the treatment effect of switching from some other institution to the listed institution in the chart. And what we see is that switching to unified Republican control of redistricting moves the efficiency gap by about 5 percentage points in a Republican direction. And this is a large and statistically significant effect. Symmetrically, switching to unified Democratic control of redistricting moves the efficiency gap by 5 percentage points in a Democratic direction. And again, this is a large and statistically significant effect. And then conversely, the other two kinds of institutions on the chart, so divided government and court control over redistricting, don't have a significant impact one way or the other. You know, they're not consistently tilted in favor of either party. And so this sort of confirms what we might have expected, that partisan control of redistricting makes a big difference, and that nonpartisan institutions don't significantly move the efficiency gap in either party's benefit. Now, this is the more elaborate regression model, where we have the same institutions as in the previous analysis, and we now also have the continuous variables that I mentioned. So Black and Latino seat share, urbanization, and just the overall Democratic share of the vote in a state. And there's a lot of information here, so I'll break it down by hypothesis. So first, this now shows you the impact of switching from divided government, that's the baseline case, to one of these other institutions. And what we see is that, again, unified Republican control is associated with a significant pro-Republican boost in the efficiency gap, vice versa for unified Democratic control. Interestingly, commissions and courts are not quite statistically significant, but there is at least a hint here that Republicans tend to do pretty well under commissions, and Democrats tend to do pretty well under court-drawn maps. I think more research is needed for those effects, but they're certainly interesting that we're noticing some consistent partisan directions for supposedly nonpartisan plans. Now here are the results for African American and Latino seat share. And this shows you the impact of what happens to the efficiency gap if you increase the Black or the Latino seat share in a state by 1 standard deviation. And what we see for Latinos is that there's no trade-off. You can increase Latino representation without affecting the efficiency gap one way or another. However, there does seem to be a trade-off between Black descriptive representation and the efficiency gap. So increasing the seat share for African Americans in a state tends to push the efficiency gap only by a couple of points, but still in a Republican direction. Now, I've argued in the past, and so have other academics, that this trade-off between minority representation and partisan fairness is not inevitable. Instead, it's a contingent trade-off, and you can avoid that trade-off if, for example, Democrats are in control of redistricting. Democrats would use a different strategy when drawing the lines. They would not over-concentrate minority voters in majority-minority districts. They would allocate them more efficiently across the whole state, while still allowing enough of those districts to be won by the minority candidates. And sure enough, we see here that when Democrats are in control of redistricting, the trade-off disappears. So in that particular set of cases, you can increase the Black seat share, you can increase the Latino seat share without reducing or otherwise affecting the efficiency gap in the state. I'll move quickly through the rest of this set of slides here. So here we see that the level of urbanization in a state, as you increase the level of urbanization, that tends to move the efficiency gap in a Republican direction. The converse holds as well. As states become more rural, their efficiency gaps tend to move by a significant margin in a Democratic direction. So the impact of political geography is not unidirectional and always benefiting Republicans. Sometimes political geography significantly benefits Democrats, and sometimes it significantly benefits Republicans. And interestingly, this effect does not go away when Democrats are in control of redistricting. So regardless of which party is in control of the line drawing, urbanization still has a consistent effect in the same direction. I'll skip these couple of slides. So what are the implications? The biggest implication is that, as we might predict, partisan control of redistricting makes a really big difference. This is the one effect that shines through all of these analyses. If you want a big efficiency gap in favor of your party, there's nothing more effective than having your party control the line drawing process. Then there's some truth to the trade-off between minority representation and partisan fairness, but this trade-off disappears when Democrats are in control of redistricting, and the trade-off only ever applies to African American representation. It doesn't apply to Latino representation. And there's also some truth to the argument that political geography matters for partisan fairness. I see my time is short. Let me quickly run through some findings on the representational consequences of large efficiency gaps. This analysis here is basically analogous to Chris and Chris's analysis, only it's at the congressional rather than the state house level. And I'll skip the explanation because it's the same explanation that Chris gave in his talk. So here you see on the y-axis the average ideology of congressional delegations. And congressional delegation ideology is measured using something called a DW nominate score, which is calculated based on all of the votes that members of Congress take. On the x-axis, you see the Democratic percentage of the statewide vote in a given state in a given year. And I've subdivided the different cases based on whether there's a large Democratic gerrymander, a more neutral plan, or a large Republican gerrymander in effect in the state. And what you can see here is that gerrymandering has a big and consistent impact on representation in Congress. So take a 50-50 state, a perfectly tied state. If that state has a Democratic gerrymander, then that state's delegation will be pretty liberal in Congress. If that state has a more neutral map, you also get more neutral representation in Congress. And if, on the other hand, that state has a Republican gerrymander in place, then you get a significantly more conservative ideology for the delegation in Congress. And the shift is really large. It's about 1 standard deviation. So keeping the electorate constant, not a single voter changes their minds. As you go from a Democratic to a Republican gerrymander, you've dramatically changed how that same population, those same voters, are represented in Congress. And this effect holds up when we do near neighbor matching. We again find that large Democratic gerrymanders move the ideology of the congressional delegation significantly in a liberal direction. Large Republican gerrymanders shift the efficiency gap significantly, shift the ideology significantly in a conservative direction. So final point here is that the efficiency gaps in gerrymandering are not just about votes and seats, how votes translate into seats. That's all a little bit abstract and a little bit bloodless. Gerrymandering really matters for the quality of representation. It affects how voters and how states are represented in the national legislature. And that's a big part of why we should care about this. It's not some mathematical exercise. This really affects the positions that legislators take, the way that they represent their constituents in Congress, and that's a big deal. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. A lot of great research, and like all great research, it leaves as many questions for further research as it answers. Dan, do we have time for 1 or 2 questions? I know we started a little late. Okay, so we'll just do a couple of questions, and I'm going to just be unfair and say, let's start over there.
You want to take a few questions?
Yeah, let's take the three people, 1, 2, and 3, and we'll go there. Yep. Then let me bring the microphone to you so everyone can hear it.
I'd like the panel to talk about, thank you. I'd like the panel to talk about what we gain through looking at the efficiency gap compared to what we've looked at for a long, long time, which would be the conversion of a percentage of votes into the percentage of seats. For a long time, we've had seat bonus that we could express as a percentage difference in the number of votes and the number of seats. It almost seems to me that you could call that the efficiency gap. That's the ultimate result of how you have reduced or whatever in the efficiency gap. Now, we looked at that for a long time. And for a long time, people have said, that's actually pretty simple and really, so we've gone on to symmetry and all sorts of things like that. But that's simple, just like the efficiency gap. In fact, I think the ultimate number may even be more intuitive and more informative. Because you're telling us, okay, so the efficiency gap is minus 1.9. Okay, I understand, you can compare that to other states, you can rank things and all that, but how intuitive is a 1.9 as opposed to saying, hey, they had 40% of the seats, they got 40% of the votes, they got 60% of the seats. Good, I'm done.
No, we'll get the questions all out.
All right, great. My question is basically for Nick. Nick, have you studied the effect of the traditional criteria on the efficiency gap? I mean, it's widely regarded, believed, that respecting boundaries, compactness are neutral. Are they, in fact, neutral, or do they affect the efficiency gap?
Right. And then one more question back here.
Thank you. My question is for Simon. Would you mind defining the numbers that you used in the calculation in the numerator and denominator? Just define what those numbers are.
Okay. So 3 questions, and the panelists can answer them where they want. I'll bring the microphone back down.
Okay. That last one is really simple, so I'll just take it straight away. In the numerator, it's just the wasted votes for the Republicans minus the wasted votes for the Democrats. Right? And then that's the numerator. In the denominator, you have just the total votes cast for Democrats and Republicans.
Thank you.
So,
You can swing at this.
yeah. So it's true that the most intuitive figure in this area would just be the difference between a party's vote share in a state and a party's seat share in a state. So a party gets 45% of the vote, 53% of the seats, 8% difference, boom, you're done. 2 problems with that measure. One is that if there's one thing we know from Supreme Court cases, is that cannot be the measure of partisan gerrymandering. If there's one thing the Supreme Court has clearly precluded, it's proportionality as an ideal and deviation from seat vote proportionality as a measure of the extent of gerrymandering. So despite the intuitiveness of proportionality, we simply can't use it in this space. The other problem is that with single-member district systems, we don't expect proportionality. So there are theoretical reasons not to want to use a measure of seat vote proportionality, given that it's almost never achieved in American or Canadian or British or other single-member first-past-the-post systems. On the second question, it's a great topic for further research. It's hard to code the criteria that are in place in many states over many years. I've done this for a couple of decades, but I haven't done it going all the way back to 1972. There's the further concern that you're not quite sure if the announced criteria are actually the criteria that are followed in drafting a map. So the best we could do is to quantify the impact of the announced official criteria, but there could be a gap there between what the paper says and then like what the map makers actually do themselves.
Can I respond?
I think we're at our break, so it's a great dialogue, and people can continue that, but I want to keep us on track, so.
Great job. You're probably going to we just had a panel on the causes and consequences of gerrymandering. We're now going to turn our attention to measuring the phenomenon itself. So different metrics that are out there that each capture the extent of gerrymandering in a slightly different way. I'll also invoke the Carlin rule that Michael referred to before, so I won't go through the illustrious bios of the members of the panel. Let me just make two quick introductory points before turning over the floor to Michael. One point is that Whitford, the Wisconsin case, is often linked with the efficiency gap alone. But in fact, in Whitford, we introduced evidence to the court and advocated a set of partisan symmetry measures, not only the efficiency gap. So we also presented the court with 40 plus years worth of data about partisan bias and the mean median difference and the efficiency gap. This is part of our broader strategy, not to pin all of our hopes on a single metric, but rather to tell the lower court and the Supreme Court that there are several measures out there of partisan symmetry. All of them have their pros and their cons, but in states like Wisconsin and North Carolina, all of these measures point in the same direction, so the courts shouldn't feel that they have to make a decision about what the right political science measure of partisan gerrymandering is. So that's one point. Second quick point is that I think there are really interesting academic arguments to be had about the advantages and the disadvantages of the different metrics. I hope that we can combine these disagreements and these arguments to spaces like this, to academic forums, and that we don't let those disagreements spill over into litigation. If there's one really good way to lose this case in the Supreme Court, it's to have political scientists arguing over what the better or the best measure of partisan gerrymandering is. And we know this from past experience. So in LULAC, a number of prominent political scientists, including Bernie over here, offered the court one measure of partisan symmetry, partisan bias. But there were critiques of partisan bias in other briefs that went to the court, and the court picked up on those critiques, and Justice Kennedy parroted them in his opinion in LULAC. And that academic disagreement in the briefs in LULAC might be one reason why another 10 years have gone by since LULAC without a applicable Supreme Court standard for gerrymandering. So, for those who want the court to intervene and think the court intervention is advisable in this area, I would strongly recommend keeping the arguments to the academic space and not extending them to the litigation space. Thanks. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
I'm Michael McDonald. Dan's going to set me up. And Nick's words are well taken. We have some disagreements about the three different measures that will be presented today. And I'm going to make a comparison between them. And the reason I want to highlight this and to talk to this group in particular, not to get involved in disputes within the litigation territory, is to point out that if we take an alternative measure that I call the equal vote weight standard measure of symmetry, that we change the legal basis for evaluating gerrymandering. So Anna yesterday was talking to everyone about changing the basis to a First Amendment basis. I want to change the basis of talking about gerrymandering from a representational right to a voting right. And the equal vote weight standard is the mechanism that I use to make that switch. So I'm going to only give you sort of the bullet point ideas behind the equal vote weight standard and tell you that it works like this. We're looking for persistent, that is durable, as other people have talked about at this conference, asymmetry, and all we need to do is compare the median district vote percentage to the mean district vote percentage. What does that mean? It means, in the example I'm going to use in Ohio, there are 17 districts. We align them from least Democratic to most Democratic vote percentage, and we find the vote percentage of the 9th district. That's pretty simple. And then we take the 17 districts and we get the average vote percentage. If those two numbers don't match, there's a bias in the system. If those two numbers don't match in all the elections that we look at, there's a persistent bias in the districts. At that point, we have a strong suspicion that something has gone wrong, is untoward in this system. If, however, it's the case that you're in Texas, and, well, if it's the case that you're in Texas and there's this persistent difference, there's not necessarily a vote weight difference that we can tell. Because in Texas, maybe with 40% of the vote, the Democrats get 40% of the seats, sort of proportionality. And who's to say that that's unfair? I'm not going to say that. But if you violate majority rule and you have persistent bias, we know as a fact at that point that there is a vote weight difference. There's no way to violate majority rule and count all the votes equally. So we know the votes aren't being counted equally at that point. So if both are true, persistent bias, if violations of majority rule, we're looking at a gerrymander. Those are two easy things to identify in any districting plan. So what are its benefits? It's easily manageable. We're talking about two low-level calculations, the median and the mean. There's an easily identifiable observation of violation of democratic principles, certainly, and constitutional principles, in that we're violating majority rule, and that tells us unquestionably that the votes have different weights. So now we have a vote weight difference. Third, going back to yesterday's conversation about harm, we also know unequivocally that it is the lines. We don't have to worry about, well, why did they win a few extra seats in this election as opposed to 3 fewer seats. We don't have to ask that question. We know at this point that it's the placement of the lines that caused the difference. Because the only difference between the statewide vote percentage and the median vote percentage is a consequence of drawing the lines and dividing the voters into different districts. So we have the cause of the harm that's a constitutional violation under certain circumstances, and an easy calculation to get there. In the interest of time, I'm going to give you an application of this so it doesn't all seem terribly abstract. 17 statewide elections, and a shout out to Daily Coast for organizing these data. Someone from Daily Coast is here, right? Yes. Great data organization. And we are particularly thankful for everything you've done thus far. So 17 statewide elections aggregated into the 2012 districts in Ohio. All 17, according to the median difference, are biased against the Democrats. So every one of those 17 elections, looking at persistence, different biases, are biased against the Democrats. Majority rule is violated every time an election is held among these 17 where the Democrats don't win at least 55% of the vote. Then, of course, we have to worry about residential patterns. So we generated 10,000 neutral districts for districting plans, not districts, districting plans for Ohio, and use that as a baseline for comparison against, well, what would the normal, neutrally drawn median mean difference look like? We find in those 10,000 neutral plans that there's no systematic asymmetry working against either the Democrats or the Republicans. Those are the numbers, but I'm not going to pause on the numbers. We can come back. It's here in case someone asks about it. Here's the state-vote relationship across those 17 different districts. You can see that with 42% of the vote, or 45% of the vote, or 49% of the vote, or 49.8% of the vote, the Democrats get 4 of those 17 seats. And even as you cross into the 4 elections in which the Democrats win a majority of the vote, they can't win a majority of the seats. We know at this point that there's a bias in the system, it's persistent, it occurs in every one of these 17 elections, and it violates majority rule up to a limit of, you need 55% of the vote to win a majority of the seats. We heard just for an hour, 1 minute, in Ohio's 17 elections, the efficiency gap, and here's where we get into potential academic disagreements, as Nick talked about. It's not a reliable way to look at these 17 different elections. The efficiency gap tells us in 4 of those elections, the efficiency gap is a pro-democratic gerrymander. In 4, it's not a gerrymander at all. And in 9, it's pro-Republican gerrymander. We didn't talk about Joey Chen's, Jonathan Robbins, and others' expected win standard, but if we apply that standard, it too turns out to be unreliable in the sense that 3 elections are pro-democratic, 4 elections are not gerrymanders according to the standard, and 10 are pro-Republican. That was the underlying data for those calculations. Finally, we did a nationwide check of all the congressional district plans for states with 3 or more districts, and we find that there are persistent biases in 25 states. Every single election we've analyzed, up to 17, 20, 24 in some states, showed biases against the Democratic, against one or the other party. 13 of the states violate majority rule, so 12 of the states, while biased, are not gerrymanders, I would say. Time's up. 12 are pro-Republican gerrymanders. 1, possibly, New Mexico, is a pro-Democratic gerrymander. I'm going to drop. We need a reliable standard. My point, we can't have false positives and false negatives going into the courtroom. The equal vote weight standard meets that need. We need an efficient computer program like Wendy Tan shows so that we can make comparisons and subset to plans that have 5 majority minority districts, 4, 3, 7, 8. And finally, we need to rethink our conceptual legal basis from thinking about gerrymandering as a representational right violation to a voting right violation. Thank you. Thank you for the extra minute and a half.
Okay, I'll try to be as quick as I can. While we're waiting, I just wanted to say, the heck with shoes. Nick has the most awesome socks I've ever seen. Right? I mean, seriously, they are amazing, like those are amazing socks, dude. So I feel a little bit inadequate. I have ordinary shoes and ordinary socks. All right, so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about, I want to, rather than get into discussions about how sort of the normative part of this, like what we think of, what we think fairness should be in redistricting, which we can definitely have that conversation. I want to sort of look at the mechanics of these measures a little bit and see if they measure what we think they're measuring, And by that, and for this particular presentation, I want to look at one particular way of deciding that it's measuring what we think it's measuring. So the question here is, what do we mean by partisan advantage? There's a lot of different things we can mean about that, and I'll get to those, to some of the alternatives more at the end. But for this particular presentation, I want to focus on one particular idea of partisan advantage, which I call efficiency. Now, since I'm the creator of a measure called the efficiency gap, I think you can see where this is going, but nonetheless, the idea here is if a party wins more seats without receiving more votes, then it is winning more efficiently than it was before. So the idea of efficiency is that you are translating your votes into seats better, more effectively, more efficiently than the opposition. So that implies an efficiency principle, which is just sort of a repackaging of the concept, and says if a party wins more efficiently, then a measure of efficiency, if you claim it as a measure of efficiency, should then shift in that party's favor. If a party, without gaining any more votes, without getting any more support from the public, wins more seats, and your efficiency measure moves in the opposite direction, then you have a problem with that as a measure of efficiency. So what do I do here? My goal here is to basically tease out the mathematics of a bunch of these different measures using simulations. So this is fake data, but my goal here is not to say necessarily what's happening in reality, but to sort of interrogate the mathematics of these things, because I'm not smart enough to figure out all the implications of them myself. And so I run for each of a set of fixed vote shares, I simulate hundreds of plans, each of which has different seat shares for, again, a fixed vote share. And so the question here is, again, getting back to this efficiency principle, how often does a seat share with a fixed vote share move in one direction and a particular bias measure move in the other direction? And what's the largest such deviation we see? And the goal here is to have no violations of the efficiency principle across all vote shares. Again, if it's an adequate measure of the concept of efficiency. So here, what I'm going to do is look at this for first the sort of symmetry measures that Michael has talked about on his measure, plus a more traditional measure, and then look at it for a sort of family of potential wasted votes measures, which includes the efficiency gap. So on the x-axis here, you have, this is just looking just at two parties. You have the vote share for one of the parties, which means the other is 1 minus that, and then, or 100 minus that, percentages. And then along the x-axis, the share of simulations that violate that efficiency principle. And what you see is that for these symmetry measures, the violations get more frequent as you get above competitive elections, as it becomes more lopsided in one direction. But they're still kind of present even in competitive elections. Here's the maximum violation in the simulations. And it's fairly modest, 10 to 20% maybe, in the competitive elections, and then it gets up to much larger, 40% or more for uncompetitive systems. So it's the uncompetitive systems that are wrong. Here's the same thing for different measures of wasted votes. And again, we've talked about what wasted votes measures are, as sort of tabulating votes that don't contribute to victories on either side. And what I have here is 4 different possibilities. Each of the columns is a different possible wasted votes measure. This is the efficiency gap. I've extended it, and I'll talk about it at the end. I extended it a little bit to incorporate different kinds of dynamics, different kinds of systems. Here's a suggested alternative that came from the dissent in the Wisconsin case. This is another one that somebody proposed to me, and here's one that uses essentially a different denominator. And what you see is that the only one, so you want to see flat line across the bottom, right? And the only one that satisfies that in every condition, here on each of the rows is vote shares for third parties. So again, we're expanding this beyond 2 parties to look at third parties. Several of these work great, not this one, but several of them work great when you don't have third parties. When you start introducing third parties, things start to fall apart. Although, you know, it's not too bad over on these 2 on the end here. And then this is the maximum violation. Again, the maximum violation is not terribly large for these, but it's real sometimes. This one is, again, a mess. And the efficiency gap is essentially 0. Not essentially, it is 0. There's also, I just want to briefly mention that there's these contextual measures that a lot of people talk about. So Wendy Tam Cho's simulations, Michael's simulations that he presented, Joey's simulations that he's going to talk about, I think, after me. Those plus a variety of others that people have proposed, I think it was kind of contextual measures that take a particular redistricting plan and seat them in some kind of larger context. I think these are actually excellent, can be excellent for defining intent. But I would argue that none is really a standard of fairness in most cases. That we should keep the 2 things separate. If you have a set of simulations, say, that suggest that the typical plan will be 40% of the seats for Democrats and 50% of the votes for Democrats, and then a plan is drawn that gives Democrats 50% of the votes and 50% of the seats. It might be an outlier in that distribution of potential plans, but you wouldn't want the courts to intervene there and move things back to the 40% seat mark, right? So I think we need to use these things in combination with a notion of fairness, which I think is how they're typically used, but I think it's important to make that clarification. All right, so I'm wrapping up here. Again, I mentioned that I got an extension to the efficiency gap for differential turnout malapportionment, as well as for dealing with third parties. I can talk about that more in the Q&A if people want. And I think it's important to mention what this does not measure, like what I'm not testing here. I'm not testing majority entrenchment, which I think is actually what the symmetry measures do a good job of testing, right? Which is, does the majority protect itself from losing seats as it loses votes? I will say you can actually use the efficiency gap to do that kind of calculation yourself, but if you find one of these other measures more appealing, I think that they work great for that. Intent, as I just mentioned, I don't think we're testing intent here. It's a totally separate concept. Not looking at strangely shaped districts. I'm actually not a big fan of that as a test of gerrymandering. And we also don't know the point at which we should care. And that's going to be a big issue in the court case, has been a big issue in the court case, and in previous litigation on gerrymandering. We don't know when we should care with any of these measures, right? And that's it. Thank you.
I'm Joey Shen. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, and I'm going to talk today about the work that I do in redistricting cases, helping mostly plaintiffs to assess partisan and racial gerrymandering claims, and I do so using simulations of districting maps. So I draw a large number of simulated maps using various criteria in order to help plaintiffs assess gerrymandering claims and help them to sort out whether a plan was drawn because of particular partisan racial motives, or whether they were drawn to favor traditional redistricting criteria, and to be able to sort out specific criteria, and if there is a partisan gerrymander, for example, to be able to pin the gerrymander on a specific violation of a particular districting criterion or a couple of criteria. And so I'll show you the power of being able to use simulated maps to be able to get very specifically, not towards measuring, not towards simply measuring a gerrymandering claim, not towards measuring how much gerrymandering affected a map, but to be able to tell a broader story, a more holistic story about exactly how a map came to be, what it does specifically, what components went into it, to be able to tell this broader story about how a gerrymandering map came to become a gerrymandered map, and what sort of trade-offs were made, what specific trade-offs were made. So the kinds of cases that I've done work in are both partisan and racial gerrymandering claims, which I'll talk a little bit about both today. And I've done this at a variety of levels. Cases involving congressional districting plans, involving state legislative districts, and also county boards, county school boards, and city council districts. So I've done this at a variety of levels. But specifically what I've done, as I said, is to be able to not just get at measuring, not just measuring gerrymandering caused a change in X number of seats, but to be able to specifically help plans to weave together a more compelling, broader, holistic story about how gerrymandering came to be, what trade-offs it made in order to achieve the gerrymander. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to start with an illustration from one case here. So what I'm going to show you is I'm going to talk about how I do actually measure the simple fact of gerrymandering, show that it was a gerrymandering, and talk to you about how many seats or districts, for example, that the gerrymandering affected. But I'm also going to show you how using the sort of simulation approach that I use helps to explain to a court. It reveals what sort of traditional districting criteria were sacrificed, were subordinated in the pursuit of a gerrymander, whether it's a partisan or a racial gerrymander. And I'm going to show you some illustration of how this sort of approach has been valued by judges for determining whether a districting plan was motivated either by partisanship or by racial considerations, or whether it could have been justified by traditional redistricting criteria. And we've had success at being able to explain this and help judges understand this approach and help them to see how this simulation approach is able to help them see a broader story of how a plan came to be and help them to understand this broader analytical story that we're telling, even if they don't need to understand all the details of the simulation algorithm itself. So I'm going to show you an example from Wake County case. This case is Raleigh-Wake County Citizens Association against the Wake County Board of Elections. And this is a case in which the General Assembly of North Carolina, mid-districting cycle, redrew the county commissioner districts for Wake County. And as part of this particular bill that the General Assembly passed, it drew a 7 single district plan. This is a plan that created 4 out of 7 Republican seats, 4 Republican seats out of 7. Wake County is a county that is broadly about 55 to 60% Democratic vote share in recent elections. So you can certainly see the asymmetry. And so certainly measuring that partisan gerrymandering is one step, but just the first step along what I'm able to do here. And so the plaintiffs here were voters that were represented by Anita Earls and the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And Anita did a really great job of explaining my approach to judges and be able to help them to understand the analytical power and helping them to understand where this map came from, what were the trade-offs that were made in the pursuit of a partisan gerrymander. And so I'm going to illustrate how I use simulated maps to do that. This is just one example. So what I've shown you on here is the actual enacted 7-district plan. What I'm showing you here on the right is an example of one of my simulated plans. And in doing this sort of work, I'll draw hundreds, sometimes thousands, of simulated plans like the one you see on the right, and be able to measure it, optimize it for certain traditional redistricting criteria, like obviously compactness here. The simulated plan is much more compact, but also things like keeping together precinct boundaries or DTD boundaries, keeping together municipal boundaries, and following equal population more strictly than the enacted plan did. All of these are various traditional redistricting criteria on which the enacted plan often falls quite short of what the simulated plans are able to do. So that's the basic approach here, and I'm going to do lots of simulations, and using a variety of different approaches in some cases, and be able to compare the partisan outcomes, racial outcomes, etc., of simulated plans versus the enacted plan. And I'll show you how that weaves together a broader compelling narrative, not just measuring the gerrymandering, but explaining how the gerrymandering came to be, what sorts of trade-offs were made. So first I'm going to show you of an example. In the Wake County case, here's how the Fourth Circuit understood my work. And it's really important that judges really understand the point of doing this sort of work and understand the broad analytical and storytelling power of being able to show a lot of simulations like this. So here's an illustration of how the Fourth Circuit was able to, in its ruling on the Wake County case, able to understand the approach that I was using. The Fourth Circuit said that Dr. Chen's computer simulations are based on the logic that if a computer randomly draws 500 redistricting plans following traditional redistricting criteria, and the actual enacted plan, the General Assembly's plan, fall completely outside of the range of what the computer has drawn, one can conclude that the provisional criteria do not explain that enacted plan. So the Fourth Circuit really got it in this case. They really understood the power of looking at plans drawn using various combinations of traditional redistricting criteria and then comparing that. And to do that, not just simply to measure gerrymandering, but to be able to understand what factors motivated or did not motivate a districting plan. And so the Fourth Circuit really understood here the analytical power of using this sort of approach. So here's an example of simulations and the simulation results that I did in the Wake County case. I did, as I said, several hundred simulations, and I'm going to compare the simulations to the enacted plan, the General Assembly's enacted plan, on a wide variety of approaches. This is a measure that just looks at, on the vertical axis, how many Republican seats were created. As I told you earlier, the enacted plan creates 4 Republican seats out of 7 total districts, even though Wake County is kind of a Democratic county. So they get 4 out of 7, and that's the red star that you see on the upper right corner. All the 500 blue circles that you see here, those are simulations. All the simulations create mostly 2 Republican districts, about 80% of the time. Sometimes you get 1 and sometimes you get 3, but mostly you get 2. So certainly you can measure the partisan gerrymandering that way. Clearly it created at least 1 additional Republican seat. But here's the real power that I've been talking about here of my simulation approach that the court was able to really pick up on. That it helps to tell us specifically what trade-offs were made. And here's just one example of this. Along the horizontal axis, what we're seeing here is the overall population deviations. The enacted plan deviated quite a bit from equal population, and that enabled the enacted plan to achieve this partisan gerrymander. So this approach is helping courts to understand this broader story, not just the fact that there is a partisan gerrymander, but how it came to be. They sacrificed population deviations. In another similar case, I even went a step further to be able to show that if you do simulations, specifically allowing for such high population deviations, you are sometimes able to achieve such a partisan gerrymander. And that helps to project a more compelling, broader story here about which specific districting criteria were sacrificed, were subordinated in the pursuit of the predominance of partisan considerations. And I'm going to show you this is how the court understood my work here. And it was really able to grasp the analytical power of it. This is what the Fourth Circuit said about what you just saw. The Fourth Circuit said in its ruling in this case, the import of Dr. Chen's simulations was not just to produce better plans, but rather to hold several legitimate apportionment considerations constant so that Dr. Chen could assess whether the population deviations in the challenged plans could have been the product of something other than partisan bias. And so that is the real power here of using this simulation approach, is that when plaintiffs are able to express this and help judges to understand this, it is very simple and very possible for judges, as you can see here, to be able to grasp the basic logic, the analytical logic of using this kind of approach. And so this is just an illustration of how the court was able to do that. Thank you.
Well, it is certainly my pleasure to be here. I'm going to go as quickly through the 57 slides. There were some questions whether I could get through 57. But around 2 a.m. last night, I added 10 just to make it a little harder for me to do this. So let's just see actually what's going on. Obviously, I skipped somehow the joke. I don't quite know what happened to the joke, but I'll give the joke anyway. The joke, of course, is that I'm listed here as the Inquisitor. Now, I find that a little bit strange, and in particular, I was really quite upset that I wasn't listed as the Grand Inquisitor, because that would give me the necessary Russian connection, which would make me really feel quite at home in the present presidential regime. But I have also been a special master, and as the church lady said, that is indeed special. Now, I want to begin actually with a definition of gerrymandering, and then I want to, actually the definition of a gerrymander. Believe it or not, we actually haven't heard anything that at least I would call a definition of a gerrymander. It's more or less been of the I know it when I see it category. Then I want to do is to talk about Whitford v. Gill, because even though I am not a knight sans peur et sans reproche, it has indeed been the case that for roughly the last 3 decades, for me, the Holy Grail has been the quest for a test of partisan gerrymandering, beginning with the very first case in partisan gerrymandering, Davis v. Vandermeer, in which I am in fact, little known, the expert witness for the state Republican Party, testifying correctly, even with hindsight, that the Indiana that plan was not actually a partisan gerrymander as provided by the evidence of the expert witness on the other side. And I would still, in fact, stick to that particular point of view. But in several amicus briefs, I have in fact argued for a particular partisan gerrymandering test. But I'm not going to argue for that now. What I actually am going to argue for is for a multi-componented test. And I'm also going to argue, and this is the single most important thing that I am going to say today, and that is Whitford v. Gill. Repeat, Whitford v. Gill. Whitford v. Gill gets it right. Whitford v. Gill does not rely on a single test for a single notion, namely asymmetry or bias or efficiency gap. Whitford v. Gill provides a multi-component approach that addresses each and every one of the concerns, not just of the single justice, whom we all know and love and hope his heartbeat will last forever, but it also addresses the concerns of at least another 4 justices who actually did not sign on to Justice Kennedy's views at any point in the last 25 years, and who therefore must be persuaded that they too should in fact believe that we have found the Holy Grail, a test for partisan gerrymandering. So now I will, and it says if time permits in my slide. Time will not permit, forget that. Okay, moving right along. So now we have the question, what is a gerrymander? Now, it turns out that there is a legendary expert in this area, Bob Dixon, who in 1968 gave the definition of gerrymander that obviously is what has affected the court, and indeed many of us ever since. Whether or not there's a gerrymander design, basically in a functional sense, everything you do whenever you draw a line, it's a gerrymander. Now, the problem with that definition is it makes it very, very hard to decide what constitutes unconstitutionality, because it suggests that basically politics as usual is line drawing, and therefore we ought not to really concern ourselves with that kind of politics as usual. Now, I think Dixon was wrong, and so was I, actually, when I parroted his words for lots of the time. He was right that we need to distinguish 2 features of the world, namely those situations where gerrymandering is intentional, and those situations where it occurs, if you will, naturally through geography, through geographic features, or simply possibly by chance. And it can occur also when people are stupid, and my good office mate and colleague, A. Wuffel, coined the phrase dummy-mander. to refer to a plan which was intended to advantage one party, but actually advantage the other once the electoral tithes went the wrong way. Now, so I'm going to say, let me go back here. Gerrymandering occurs when a districting plan creates a disparate treatment of the vote share of the minority and majority voting blocks in a way that penalizes the minority in its ability to translate its voting support into seats compared to what we might expect from a plan drawn on the basis of neutral principles. Now notice, by the way, where my hand is currently pointing, because this is a definition of gerrymandering which is consistent with, I think, most of the social science views of what a gerrymander is. And even those who have not explicitly referenced alternative plans implicitly are doing so, whether it's the partisan gap or other things like that, because they're thinking about whatever disparate impact happens relative to what we would expect in a better world, shall we say. Now, this is not a definition of, it's a definition of gerrymandering, not a definition of unconstitutional gerrymandering. Because to get to unconstitutional gerrymandering, you need more pieces. So, gerrymandering is defined relative to what is possible. It is not proportional ever representation. It begins with an understanding that we have partisan bias and also possibly so-called swing, which is nonpartisan, which is involving something like, oops, I probably have the wrong one. All right. Here we go. Mea culpa. In my attempts over the years to persuade the Supreme Court that there ought to be a reasonable test of partisan gerrymandering, I have swung from one to the other extreme. When I was young, I tried to have everything. And so I had a proposed test for partisan gerrymandering that had 12 flags, yes, sorry, I can't remember which it is anymore. 12 flags and 2 whistles. And that turned out to be much too complicated and really, really hard to implement in a manageable way. And then I went to the other extreme, which is often what happens in our lives, and I actually advocated a plan, an idea that was much too simple. And that was the idea of partisan symmetry a la Tufte, a la Gelman, King, and Groffman too. Okay, now it turns out that there is a children's tale. I am a Goldilocksian at heart. A Goldilocksian is somebody who basically says that somewhere in between too complicated and too simple, there is in fact a golden mean, and that is exactly what the standard that we want should be, and that standard is going to be multi-componented, and it has to address the concerns of the court in Bandemer that we have durability. Oops, there am I. Sorry about that. No single measure gets everything that we want. Think of the world, think of gerrymandering as an elephant. Not a Republican elephant, just an average elephant. And it turns out that if we think about gerrymandering, it has multiple pieces. And so if you said that the elephant had a tail, you wouldn't be wrong. And if you said that the elephant had tusks, you wouldn't be wrong. And if you said that the elephant had a kind of very leathery skin, you wouldn't be wrong. But all of those are true of the elephant, but they don't, we need many of them in order to actually accurately characterize the elephant. Rather than talking about the specific test, though I will actually put some names to these pieces, it seems to me very clear when you look at Whitford that what Whitford does is essentially enunciate, and I'm going to make it a 5-prong test, not a 3-prong test, even though I, as the Thornburg guy, I actually like a 3-prong Jingles test. 5, it turns out, there has to be a clear and severe injury involving disparate impact. There has to be effects that can be expected to be durable. There have to be effects that can be shown not to be explainable by chance, not to be explainable by geography. There has to be compelling direct or indirect evidence of partisan intent. And there must be a remedial plan that addresses the constitutional violation while also satisfying, on balance, all relevant constitutional and statutory criteria, at least as well as the challenged plan. Now notice, by the way, that what I am proposing largely is a statewide, plan-wide standard, but the remedy is going to be district-specific. So the argument as to whether it ought to be a district-specific notion or a statewide notion is actually a silly argument, because it can be a statewide notion, but it's always going to be a district-specific remedy. Moving right along, basically it's essentially Whitford. The main difference between it and Whitford is that I'm going to do it a little bit differently because I really do want to talk about the 5 things, and then the courts can say, okay, here are different indicators of each of the 5 things. And let me go on. I'm just going to skip this. Let me just say that if I do each of the 5 things, every expert witness who has testified so far gets his or her time in court. And on that happy thought, I will end.
We have time for maybe a couple of questions from the audience before we move on to our next panel. If anybody's will take a couple of questions now, we can let the panelists then respond to them.
I come from the largest underrepresented majority on the planet, women. I haven't heard anything in a day and a half addressing the underrepresentation of women. I waited till today to see if the representativeness was going to cover that. Women are being harmed by the policies enacted by gerrymandered districts. Where is the study? Where's the court case? How long do we have to wait?
I'm wondering, as you develop districts that don't have gerrymandering bias, is there a convergence so that you can identify specific kinds of line drawing and division? Do your plans that don't have bias begin to converge on a map that is in fact fair?
That's your second question.
You guys want to go first?
I think to answer the first question, we have to go back to the presentations at 9 o'clock, which were about policy in particular. And women and men are so residentially integrated that, of course, we're not talking about drawing majority female, majority, and their voting patterns aren't polarized. Men and women differ, but not by some enormous amount. So I would say that the gerrymandering effect that is operating in ways that are adverse toward women are the partisan gerrymandering effects, and we saw this in the policy consequences that were presented earlier by Chris.
I'll just add to that, what I said, which makes a lot of sense, is that political scientists have increasingly studied not just racially polarized voting, but also what types of voters are more likely to vote for a female candidate. And to some degree, there's most likely a bit of geographic clustering, concentration of those types of more progressive voters. And so it makes a lot of sense to study the consequences of districting when you place districts on top of voters that either may or may not be willing to vote for female candidates. And let me just address the second question, which is that there's no such thing as a perfect plan. What there are several different traditional district criteria. And the power of what my approach is able to show courts, and the courts have really grasped onto, is that there are trade-offs. If you want a gerrymander, you have to give up something like equal population. In many other partisan gerrymandering cases, it actually comes down to giving up geographic compactness. And so what I'm able to show is the trade-off between those things and how courts understand they only were able to draw a gerrymander plan because they made sacrifices. They subordinated geographic compactness or they subordinated county splits. So that's what we're able to get to.
Right. We'll do a couple.
Hi, my name is Stephen Wolf, and I'm from Daily Coast Elections, and my question is for Joey mainly. How would you answer the charge that your random redistricting algorithm is actually not random and has a significant Republican bias because of its data set and parameters? And by what I mean by that is, A true random plan would involve all combinations of all individual residents in a state or country or district, whereas the inputs you have available are precincts or census blocks which are not equal in population or size, and you tend to have a clustering of high population precincts and census blocks in urban areas and low population in rural areas, meaning there are more possible combinations the computer could draw with rural voters than urban voters. And what we've seen is in Florida, where you testified as the expert witness, your research had said that it was highly unlikely to have a partisan plan that had an insubstantial Republican bias, yet after court-ordered redistricting, we've seen that the median seat advantage is almost negligible. So how would you address that charge if you were to testify and say Whitford v. Gill?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And it's something that I've written quite a bit of academic research on as well, which is that there is quite a bit of geographic bias in the way that we build together districts, since states tend to use census blocks and BTDs as the building blocks of districts. That, as Stephen correctly points out, has built in quite a bit of geographic bias differences between urban and rural areas. That is the world we live in. You know, what I try to do is not, see, this is why Eric and Nick's stuff is very valuable, because it gives us a framework for understanding fairness. What I'm looking at is not an inherent normative standard of fairness or a legal standard of fairness. I help to assess intent. That's why you need both efficiency gap stuff as well as my stuff here. But in just looking at intent, I started with the rules as, say, the North Carolina State Board of Elections sets up the data the General Assembly starts with. That includes this BTV stuff and the census block stuff. That's how they draw districts. They don't draw districts in a vacuum. And so we have to start with that role, because what I try to do is to get at the legislature's intent and to help the court understand here are the choices that the legislature faced when it drew districts, and here are the trade-offs that it made. What you're talking about is a deeper standard of fairness and how districts can be drawn in a fair world. That's where Nick and Eric's stuff is really helpful.
Just to clarify, I'm not talking about actual fairness. I'm talking about the proportion of plans that have different partisan qualities that you were coming up with don't actually reflect what a true random distribution of sample plans would look like, because you literally cannot have a random sample of every individual because of the census block constraints. And I guess what I'm getting at in concrete terms is when we look at actual example nonpartisan plans, they don't conform to what your median estimate would look like.
Yeah, Stephen's absolutely right. I'm not trying to draw random plans at all. And that's not really, that's because it's not really compelling for the court to see the entire range of really random plans, including some very non-compact plans, plans with weird-shaped districts, with really snake-like districts, have strange configurations. That's not really interesting when we're getting at this very specific question of here is the geographic world and the boundaries that the state legislature started with, and here are the choices they made, trading off on different traditional districting criteria. So I only care about simulated plans that really focus on the specific districting criteria. In Florida, for example, that the Amendments 5 and 6 of the Florida Constitution specifies a list of very specific traditional redistricting criteria that were to be followed. I follow those. That's the world we live in, because I'm helping the court to understand intent, not fairness.
I think it seems to me that one way to rephrase Stephen Wolf's point with Joey is the idea that a set of rules that are used can be tested by your approach to determine whether those rules are intrinsically symmetric or not. And that feels, separately from court battles, that feels like an important thing that could be used as guidance for the writing of a future referendum. I had a question for Bernie Groffman, which is in this 5-element standard that you suggest, that you think is such, that you favor, that you listed. And the second point was one of durable effects. And I just have a practical question of concern, which is that testing for a durable effect, depending on how one tests it, requires several elections to go by. And now that we're in 2017, the horse has left the barn. And so I'm a little bit concerned about exactly technologically or by any means how one would demonstrate a durable effect before the offense has been committed. Is there a solution to that?
Yes, the solution is to have the Supreme Court adopt the Whitford standard, because in fact The case was brought in 2016, and therefore we already have the 2014 and 2016 and 2012 data, which will avoid, for the moment, the problem of whether or not we could have, with 2012 data, have accurately predicted what would happen in 2014 and 2016. And once we actually have the court confronting a horrible, with absolutely clear and compelling evidence of durability, which will also apply in North Carolina, then we can worry about that question in the 2020 round, when we in fact have durability as one of the listed criteria. The way in which we would deal with that in 2020 or 2021 is that we have in Simon Jackman's work and other people's work the notion of inter-election swing, and we also have a very common sense notion, which is in effect the kurtosis of the distribution, otherwise known as how many competitive seats there are. You can't have durable plans when there are lots of competitive seats. The way in which gerrymanders assure durability is they get rid of the competition. In New York, when I was proposing a plan for the then Special Master of New York in the 1980s, we had a lovely plan. It had, quote, one competitive congressional seat. And you know what? One was too many. Because the Democrats and the Republicans in the state legislature, who had previously been at loggerheads, took a look at the court plan, which had counted one competitive seat, and they said, no, you know what? We're just going to divide things up so that you get one and we get one, and we won't have any uncertainty. And I think that cleverly done gerrymandering essentially eliminates uncertainty, because nobody wants anybody to have any options other than the options laid down by the folks drawing the lines.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.
for food before lunch. So as folks are settling back in, I'm just going to say a few quick things, and I'll compress otherwise what was going to be a very long introduction of each of our panels, but I won't do that. No one really likes to hear that their state is worst, unless maybe it's the efficiency gap. I guess that's what I've learned from Simon, that North Carolina is #1 as far as the worst outcome of an efficiency gap in that 42-year study. Maybe as a reformer, those of us in North Carolina trying to end gerrymandering now, that might be a good thing, I guess. What I was going to say is, all the great things we've heard at this conference in terms of defining efficiency, defining gerrymandering and looking at the efficiency gap, or thinking about what makes up a good redistricting plan, whether it's the criteria or who draws the maps. And also, I know we've had some discussions about building the coalition to help states pass the reform plan. Those are all wonderful things. I've learned a lot. And yet, I think we all know in the room that if we don't have a way of properly connecting messaging, having folks understand what it all means, maybe it doesn't, all the other things that we've been talking about doesn't mean as much. We've got to figure out how to connect with people, first and foremost, and believe me, it's Common Cause North Carolina, that's a challenge. How do you make this understandable? Connecting it to decision makers, connecting it to opinion shapers, the media. All that's very important. And we have 3 wonderful panelists here, and I'll just say 3 very quick things since the introductions we have. So Linda Lake, the 2014 message manual, I think, right, that you produced. A must read if you all aren't familiar with it. I gather you're probably going to talk about it. Dave Daly, we all know about his book. We all know about the title. What I will say, one thing I learned about Dave, the band REM, people know it, album document. It's the end of the world as we know it. And I feel fine. Do we know that? Does anybody know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Dave Daly is such an REM fan and pals. When that album was reissued at its 25th anniversary, Dave was selected to write the liner notes.
Are you kidding?
Wow. I thought that was cool.
That's really cool.
You're learning something here. Finally, my buddy Mitch Kogai, he's local. And Mitch and I have known each other for a long time. One thing about Dave is he's a proud master's graduate of the UNC Chapel Hill School of Journalism. That's my alma mater, so I had to throw that in, particularly tomorrow night. There's a little game going on here. Mitch Kogai is the communications director and policy analyst for the, kind of got it close, John Locke Foundation. And for those of you who do not know, it's an influential think tank here in North Carolina, co-founded by North Carolina businessman Art Pope. The John Locke Foundation and Common Cause North Carolina, the organization I work for, we co-founded the North Carolina Coalition for Lobbying and Government Reform, and we are dedicated to promoting redistricting reform together. So Mitch and I have been working together on this issue for a long time. We also share a passion for anything and everything regarding UNC Chapel Hill. Yeah, okay. I've just got to get this in, particularly being here at the University of New Jersey in Durham. Last thing I'll say. Okay. Let me turn it over here. I can get away with that today, I hope. Okay. Someone else, turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. So thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I feel like I might be the mediator between these rivalries, because that's really serious business. But so is redistricting, and so I am really, really delighted to be here and be able to share with you some of the data that we did. This polling that we did was for the Bauman Foundation, and it's going to be a subset of a bigger presentation that you can definitely get access to if you'd like. I want to thank all of you in this room, and particularly Common Cause, for their leadership on this very, very, very important issue. We are also, this stuff was all done before, this work was all done before the last election. And frankly, and in so many ways this is true, we've never had anything like the Trump era. So we don't know how things are changing. And we also don't know how things are changing in terms, we know that political institutions are on the decline, and we know that in individual states, there's an enormous amount of variation in terms of how people feel about their governor, how people feel about their state legislature, et cetera. So this is a very, very dynamic and fluid topic that we're on, but we thought it would be useful to show you and share with you just some of the very, very broad context out there. So first, looking at that context, this is nationwide data, and this is likely registered voters. And we find that voters are very, very divided on how well represented they are. And it doesn't differ a lot by region. We can't bring out state data, obviously, but in basically across the country, there's about a third of the people who feel well represented, a third of the people who don't feel very well represented, and the rest who feel kind of neutral, don't know. And in fact, one of these areas about redistricting is that people have much, much less knowledge about this than almost any other area of reform that we might have been talking about. So if we were talking about voter registration, voter fraud, if we were talking, or so-called fraud, if we were talking about money in politics or some of the other kinds of topics that we all work together on, people would have much, much more defined opinions. But in this case, people just really don't know very much about what we're talking about. Interestingly, demographically, you would think that there might be some big demographic or partisan differences, but not really. And so you can see here whites, African Americans, and Latinos all feeling basically the same. African Americans a little less well represented, Latinos a little bit more well represented, and a little bit higher unsure. But basically, people are divided and unclear about this. When we ask people the term redistricting, what is the opinion that you have of redistricting? 23% say they have a favorable opinion, 39% say they have an unfavorable opinion, and to the extent that you know about redistricting, you tend to be negative. But the overwhelming sentiment here is just a huge number of people who have no idea what we're even talking about. And then in the focus groups that we did accompanying this project, when we asked people, what do you think about redrawing the districts? And people said, wait a minute, why are they redrawing the districts? Why are the politicians putting their hands on the districts? And we said, well, you know, people change and the population moves. And at first people were like, we should keep the original districts. Okay, well that would be the 13 colonies. People not very good at history either. Then they said, well, that won't work. Good point. And then finally people said, okay, adjust for the population. One of people's absolute favorite solutions here, because they felt their own state absolutely couldn't be trusted, was to have the state next door draw their districts and they would draw the state's next door's district as the true independent commission. Gerrymandering, interestingly enough, not very well known either. A lot of people said, who's Jerry? And in fact, we found out in some of the good readings in the book that it really should have been gerrymandering. But gerrymandering also, to the extent people know what it is, they don't like it, but they really don't know what it is. Remember that people also lie like crazy in surveys and make things up. So part of this is just that the word sounded bad. But it is interesting that a majority of the public couldn't even make up how they felt about gerrymandering. So we're really talking about an area that people just really don't know very much about. This was a survey where we did do oversamples of certain states, and you can see here that in most states, people have no idea what's going on. It is only when the state gets into trouble that people know what's going on. So North Carolina has another dubious distinction of being the state where people knew the most about what was going on, not that favorably, but even there, half the people didn't know what was going on. Florida, which had had a huge controversy, didn't know what was going on at all. I'm not trying to make a global statement about Florida, this is just specific to redistricting. Then we asked people, once we described what redistricting was, redistricting reform, we said, what are the goals that redistricting should achieve? And people were quite clear about the goals. It should ensure that elections are fair, Stop politicians and political parties from manipulating the elections. And by the way, manipulating tests even better than rigged. People do think elections are rigged, but they think a lot of what's going on is subtle manipulation or not so subtle behind the scenes. People think that both political parties and politicians are manipulating, and they think there is true bipartisan, and your book would suggest it as well, consensus about this. They think, oh no, this is not a Democratic or Republican problem. This is an all-party problem. Everybody who could manipulate the election for their own interests would if they could. Ensure that every eligible voter can have an equal say, and ensure that every eligible voter has a say. Equality, fairness, strong values in this debate. On a second tier, those notions are so important, they're not even really contested values. They're what we would call in our business valence issues. They are so strong, they are like core values. They're unanimous. They're as popular as the 4th of July and apple pie. Now we get into a set that is a little bit more contested, but still very, very overwhelming. Stop districts that discriminate based on race. Ensure that the election process is transparent. Although people like the word accountability even more than transparency. And I loved a quote from a focus group from a guy in Michigan who said, transparency means you get to watch it go to hell. Accountability means you get to do something about it. I'd rather do something about it. Ensure that voters have a real choice among candidates. Provide more opportunities to elect new people to office. And we talked about gerrymandering and the impact on women and men, which I'm so glad about that question. Another area that voters are really concerned about is they would like more young people to run for office. So gerrymandering based on age is actually another interesting new twist that voters volunteered. Ensure that elections are competitive, although competitive elections have actually diminished in people's desirability. Because what competition now equates with people's minds is lots of people spending way more money than they should running negative ads against each other. So the notion of competitiveness has actually diminished quite dramatically as a goal. And keep neighborhoods together. People think that's a good idea, but they think you might redistrict for other reasons too. You might draw a crazy district because it represents not a neighborhood, but an economic interest, or there might be a geographic barrier. When we showed people pictures, by the way, of highly gerrymandered districts, people thought, I don't know what that means exactly. I'm not ready to say that's a bad district until I know more about what those lines represent. If they represent a corridor of economic interest, if they represent a geographic boundary, that might be a reasonable way to draw it. I will show you the graphic that worked very strongly to suggest things weren't fair. So the last thing we tested were messages, and I love that. I didn't know that signal from kindergarten. I love that word, but 4th grade education does work a little bit. Not when it comes to the third branch of government. Nobody knows what the Supreme Court is. And on a whole nother topic, when we asked people on average how many judges are there on the Supreme Court, people said 19. And we said, where did you come up with 19? And people said, well, I frankly heard 9, but it's Supreme Court, so it must be really big, so maybe 19. Who knows? God bless America. But early education around core values has created a consensus. So our strongest message was the will of the people. In America, elections are supposed to represent the will of the people, not the politicians. But partisan politicians manipulate voting mass to keep themselves and their party in power. We need to reform the rules and make the process of drawing districts impartial, so our government is of, by, and for the people. By the way, impartial tests better than independent. People think it can be independent and damn partisan, and according to your book, they're right. So that was very interesting, I thought. Fox in the hen house, a very well-trusted metaphor in American politics. Letting politicians manipulate voting maps is like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. Politicians in power shouldn't be allowed to draw voting maps that benefit themselves. We need to reform the rules and create a fair system so that voters are choosing the politicians instead of politicians choosing the voters. That last phrase, by the way, very, very popular. I'll just take 2 more minutes real quick. Votes matter. When you take the responsibility to do your civic duty and vote, you want your vote to count. But when politicians cheat, manipulate the voting maps, they're basically fixing the election outcomes. Election day is when you get to have our say, and we need to reform the rules so that every vote counts. Also strong were messages around transparency, voice, and fairness. And basically, voice, fairness, those are core voting principles. Finally, graphics matter. And we show people a bunch of graphics. We showed people gerrymandered districts, they had no idea what it meant. We showed people the maps up there and they couldn't tell. They thought it would look like kindergarten artwork. The one thing that did matter to people was the numbers, the infomercial on the right. The votes, how the votes were cast, and then how the offices were distributed. People thought those stick figures did suggest that something was wrong. So, I'll leave you with the message map, and basically, in this message map, you have to talk about the problem, you have to talk about the solution, and you have to talk about the values. This is an area where you have to establish the problem, because people don't know what the problem is. By the way, people also want aspirational, positive messages and solutions. They do not want to be told about another problem that's insolvable. And people think that right now everything is negative. So as you're positioning around redistricting, very, very important to talk about that you have a solution to this problem, or as people said, just don't raise the problem. Turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you for having me. That's great. This has been an amazing couple of days. It's been a real treat to meet and listen to all of the plaintiffs and litigators and activists, academics and technological geniuses doing such important and inspiring work on this. All I did was write a book called Rat Fucked. It was not the original name of the book. My editor was determined that they were going to call this book Gerrymandered Nation.
Wow.
A decidedly unthrilled marketing department rebelled. They saw that as a boring title that would be a serious efficiency gap when it came to, actually selling books. They brainstormed about a dozen titles. The art team mocked up covers for all of them. They sent them out to be focus grouped in the summer of 2015. The winner, far and away, was Rat Fucked. My mom still does not know I've written a book. But this should have been a sign to me and perhaps to all of us that we were entering a vulgar and angry political era that appeals to rigged elections, to broken systems, that pleas for transparency and fairness would be effective messaging. We are here to talk about messaging and communication, how you take things like efficiency gaps, wasted votes, and all of the brilliant theorems and ideas that we have been hearing about the last couple of days, and how you make people really understand and turn those numbers that Celinda just showed us around. How you take a complicated and technical issue, one that can easily inspire partisan ire, one that put people to sleep in civics class, with the exception of my fellow redistricting nerds. I'm not suggesting that we adopt the word rat fucked. It's a framing device you can't put in the newspaper or say on TV. But what it does and what readers responded to, why it focus groups so well, is clearly articulate the magnitude of the problem, the behind-the-scenes strategies and machinations, the damage inflicted onto our democracy by surgical partisan gerrymandering, and the new powerful mapping technology that insulated politicians from the ballot box and helped unleash these unaccountable supermajorities. Indeed, I'd say if you want to survey the wreckage of our fragile and rapidly decaying democracy, the most shocking and telling examples can be found in the actions of radicalized legislatures in these rat-fucked states. I'm just going to keep saying it. It's out of the bag at this point. There are stories to tell in each of these states, and a lot of you, whether it's Common Cause or the Fair Districts folks in Florida, have done the work that uncovered these stories. We have to tell them, because every one of these states has a narrative to tell that feeds into the very issues that Celinda was just talking about, of why people have such a base revulsion to the idea of democracy being manipulated. There are stories in each of these states about how politicians, strategists, dark money, shady practices, and determined partisan intent created states with lopsided legislatures that do not reflect the will of the voters. Thanks to Fair Districts Florida, we know that in 2010, after voters overwhelmingly backed 2 constitutional amendments that prohibited drawing districts that favored or disfavored an incumbent or political party, that the smartest political strategists in the state gathered and began plotting how to maintain control and how to do an end run around this. These are guys who have 7-figure contracts for firms like data targeting. They're the kinds of people who get called the most powerful people you don't know in state politics. The folks involved in these meetings say they were simply being held to inform these partisans that they couldn't have any involvement in this. Your discovery found otherwise. It might have been believable if the process hadn't revealed an agenda for that first meeting with items like communication with outside wires. How can we make that work? Evolution of maps. Should they start less compliant and evolve through the process? Later emails also revealed through discovery show the painstaking efforts these strategists made to draw lines that maximize partisan advantage, the sophisticated models and algorithms they created, and the depths they went to conceal their involvement. You could imagine it coming from a John Grisham novel. A secret shadow redistricting process, highly technical and partisan maps created by operatives and funneled into the public process under the names of real voters, sometimes their wives, sometimes a former intern using a phony Gmail address. Thanks to the Whitford case, we know what happened in Wisconsin, where operatives tied to legislative leaders and to Speaker Ryan moved into a law office across the street from the Capitol. A firm itself with deep partisan ties tried to claim attorney-client privilege for maps that all these memos showed were infected with partisan intent. It's a story of destroyed hard drives, a novel effort to use race data to pack districts around Milwaukee and Wisconsin, even while courting Latino organizations and other civil rights groups in an effort to take them off the table in future ballot, in future litigation. It's a similar story in Ohio, where Republican strategists barricade themselves into a suite at the Doubletree for months. They dub it the bunker. They tell no one where they are, and together with strategists from the Republican National Committee and Speaker Boehner's team, devise their new lines, private meetings, secret locations, personal email for state business, email exchanges that show last-minute changes to the maps with an eye for campaign contributions, maps kept private as long as they can before being shown to the public. These are things that the public hates. These are some stories we have to tell. All of this is far from boring. It's everything that voters despise about politics and politicians. It outrages people who want elections to matter, their votes to count, the side with the most votes to win. A lot of you in this room have done sophisticated computer modeling, designed theories and legal standards. But if we're trying to show people that we have a problem, there is another test, a smell test, that can communicate this. Every voter has it. Sometimes the best proof of this, a centrality of redistricting, is the extremes that partisans are willing to go to retain the power to do it themselves. There is an amazing narrative to tell in state after state, and now 3 elections into the cycle, I think we're starting to see that voters are beginning to understand what has happened here. In North Carolina, you had several hundred people out of the Capitol this week. Virginia, recently the exact same thing. Ohio next week, I know, is doing it. You are beginning to see that voters understand the link between districting and the kind of legislation being passed in their states, and that they understand that there's a link between districts and democracy, that the brokenness we all feel in our politics has something to do with wiring lines in a way that has decreased competition, the number of competitive elections, and baked in a new kind of partisanship. There is something happening here. There's an essential constituency, however, that has not learned this lesson about the primacy of maps. And I say that's our elite political news media. It will be extraordinarily difficult to build the kind of awareness we need unless this changes. I I had hoped that this book would convince fellow journalists that this was important. Instead, I think the book collided with a media culture that often seems predisposed to discount gerrymandering as a root cause for the problems in our politics. The cable news networks tend to cover this as a partisan horse race. The elite newspapers, if you look closely at the way that they frame these stories, remains really under the influence of the big sort or various geographies, advantage theories, and are kind of limited by the norms of objectivity to talk about how both sides do it, even though the degree and effectiveness of the way both sides did it in 2010 is not necessarily equivalent. Nevertheless, the media has persisted. They clung to this frame throughout the 2016 election. I think in some ways they may have been the only people who believed the House was actually in play in 2016. As we had countless panels on can Democrats take back the House, filled with partisans and political strategists who tried to keep the charade alive with a straight face. This gets in the way of public understanding. You see the same framing again and again in the New York Times, which loves to write really long, complicated stories about the struggle for Congress that actually don't even mention the words redistricting or gerrymandering, or that dismiss the maps with sort of a bizarre passive shrug that this is just the way it is. The actual history of this has been denied so many times that it almost seems like a House style in some ways. The political science keeps growing and changing. The law is evolving. Our political media stubbornly refuses to catch up. We need to figure out a way to work with the media, a smaller media stretched thin by a relentless news cycle, and endless social media demands with fewer state capitol reporters, to really watchdog these processes, to be sure they understand the context. We need political scientists and others who understand the importance of this issue to step forward as expert sources. You're all building allies and coalitions here. You also need writers that understand the context, political scientists who can explain it, and to sort of try to shift the narrative to get more people involved. The challenge for those of us who believe this process is wrong, not because we're partisans, but because we think it undermines democracy, hijacks the ballot and defies the popular will, is to make the link that the media won't, to connect our toxic extreme politics to the perversion of our district lines, and the basic building blocks of a representative democracy. The problem can't be fixed until we talk honestly about the problem. So thank you.
As we bring this up, this segment is interrupted with the short message to say that a limited supply of the aforementioned book, That Fund, will be on sale in the lobby at the lunch break, and I think they will happily inscribe it.
I'm just wondering if Brian's going to have to bleep that out every time. Bob was very kind in introducing me earlier and mentioning that I work for the John Locke Foundation. For those of you who are in the room who are not from North Carolina, I should give you a bit more of an explanation. We're a free market public policy think tank, which means that I think for probably 90% or more of the people in the room, that makes me a crazy right-winger. But it's important, if this is going to be resolved by anything other than the courts, that you bring along people who are not just of one ideological bent or another. This needs to be something that needs to appeal to people who are on the left, on the right, in the middle, who don't really think much about either party or either of the well-known ideologies. And so I think that the messaging does have to take account of more than just the criticism of those evil Republicans in this state or other states, but also just take note of the fact that this is a process that has been used by both major political parties to the disadvantage of the voters in general. So this issue is either going to be resolved by the courts, in which case the messaging probably doesn't make much difference because the courts will decide how to do it, or it will come about, redistricting form that is, because
politicians, informed by concerned voters, will decide that it's in their best interest to do something about it rather than deal with the voters' wrath. So if you're going to have a message that appeals to all voters, it's important not to treat this like you would treat a message that's used for a normal political rally. Now, I enjoy working with my friends from Common Cause, North Carolina on this issue, but I can tell you that rally earlier this week came across to me like not much different from a Democratic Party rally. And I can tell you that very few of the folks that I know who are conservative or Republicans would have had anything to do with that rally. And that hurts the overall goal of trying to get more people involved in this process. If you have time for Q&A, you can ask me why I think that, but it sounded to me like a normal Democratic Party rally. It's also important when you're talking about the need for redistricting reform, why it's good. All of the messages that Celinda mentioned in her presentation, I think, worked well with Republican audience. And yeah, I mean, what if not feeling disenfranchised and that the little guy is getting pushed down? And that's a large explanation of Trump. Whatever you think about Trump, a lot of his people were saying they're getting screwed over by the big elites. And this is the same sort of message, that people in power are using the power that they have to stop the little guy or stop the person out of power from having any role in the process. It's important, as we're making the case for redistricting reform and against gerrymandering, not to mislead about it. One, this is not something that's new. Gerrymandering, the word itself, of course, comes from Elbridge Gerry, who was a founder, was at the Constitutional Convention, was part of the earliest part of our American government. We also don't want to say that gerrymandering is the only reason why we have crazy-looking districts. One of the most despicable political ads during the last season in North Carolina was one against a sitting state Supreme Court justice that basically blamed him for two bizarre North Carolina congressional districts that were actually originally drawn in the 1990s by Democrats to protect Democrats and their majority in the congressional delegation of the time. Courts for more than 20 years had kept those same districts in place, and the Republicans in North Carolina, once they took over the redistricting process after the 2010 election, said, well, those are two good Democratic districts, let's just keep those. We know that the courts will keep those in place. We'll pack a bunch of other Democrats around Chapel and Durham into another district, and then we can try to win the rest of them. They didn't come up with the first district that has that octopus setting in the northeastern North Carolina, or the bizarre snake district that originally, when it was first drawn, went from Durham all the way to Gastonia, and later ended up going from Greensboro to Charlotte, so it was a little bit better. But that was not something the Republicans came up with. They stuck with it because basically they knew it would elect a Democrat, and they figured that courts have upheld it in the past. Let's see if they'll uphold it again. Also, another thing, we don't want to say that gerrymandering is the sole reason that Republicans control our North Carolina General Assembly. I think there's a strong case to be made that this is why they have supermajorities and why they don't have to work with people on the other side of the aisle to get legislation passed, and now that we have a Democratic governor, to overcome what are likely to be a bunch of vetoes from Roy Cooper. But if you look at the actual numbers of who voted in legislative races going back to 2000, in every, if you look at the statewide vote for North Carolina House of Representatives votes, every election since 2000, Republicans won the majority of votes, except the big 2008 first Barack Obama election. On the Senate side, there was a mix. The Republicans won in 2002, 2004, every election since 2010. The Democrats won in 2000, 2006, 2008. So if you combine all of those votes, say all North Carolina House votes, all North Carolina Senate votes, from the decade of the 2000s, which would be elections, 2000 through 2008, you would say, if you combine all those votes together, which is not how the process is done, but that's the way some people think about it, that, okay, Republicans won most votes, they should have control, or Democrats won most votes, they should have control. You would see Republicans having won 6 of those elections, and Democrats 4. But if you look at how the actual turnout in the representation turned out, Democrats ended up having control 9 times. Republicans won once, but then because our state House Speaker bought off someone else's vote, it flipped back so that the Democrats still had control. So they basically had control throughout the decade of the 2000s. And that's something, if you are trying to get Republicans on board, that's something to remind them of. Not to say, oh, we have these policies in place that we don't like now because Republicans use gerrymandering. You know, gerrymandering has been a problem in North Carolina for years and years and years. It's why people in our state know it's a problem, because they keep hearing about it, whether they like it or not. After 2000, the redistricting that took place then was in the courts all the way until through 2009. Unless the Supreme Court comes out with something definitive that finally sets a standard on districts this time around, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw court cases continuing throughout this decade now that the Republicans are going along. So I think the key part of the message that I want to get out to you is that it's important to have messaging out there that appeals to voters of all political persuasions and that treats it as a case of the elites taking advantage of the system to benefit themselves and the little guy, not as a case of, oh, this party has done all kinds of crazy things, and if we didn't have gerrymandering, the other party would be back in and would fix it. The message that I tend to put out there whenever Bob invites me to be part of these presentations is that it's a fundamental part of our representative government that you have popular sovereignty, which means, as we say, and has been, I'm sure, said many times, that the voters should choose their elected officials, not the other way around. For people on the right side of the political spectrum, that tends to be a message that seems to resonate with them. And you can tell them that even if they think that the way that the districts were drawn after the 2010 elections in North Carolina were legal, constitutional, even if you believe that they were legal and constitutional, the process was still bad and it still ought to be replaced.
Mitch and Solon and Dave, and I think we have time for some questions. Yes, I saw you first.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Mitch to, maybe you could speak to the use of incumbent language with Republicans, because a lot, I think we were talking yesterday about how in California, maybe I have the state wrong, but in California, after they went through the redistricting, the incumbents actually got together to maintain their power. How important is using incumbent language when we go out and try to build, coalitions with Republicans and Democrats?
When you mean incumbent language, you're talking about making sure that the rules built in and incumbents won't be protected?
Right, so like one of the key pieces with the Tea Party movement I'm going to use, for example, is that they were really passionate about removing incumbents and putting new people into office. Some of the research you discussed said that wasn't as strong of a concern compared to maybe some of the others. I think it still was a concern that people felt was important. So I'm just sort of wondering, is it maybe more important for one party compared to the other, and that's why you got the blended result, just that's sort of what I'm trying to glean here.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, I don't know that it's more important for one party or the other. I do think that may have some resonance. It probably depends, as we've seen with many other things. Most people dislike Congress. A lot of them like their own member of Congress, so if you're not going to protect your own incumbent, maybe it does not resonate as well. But I do think another thing that we tend to say, Bob and I have done this show many times in North Carolina talking about our redistricting reform, other than the voters should choose their elected reps, not the other way around. The other thing that I often emphasize, if it isn't otherwise emphasized in whatever news conference or event it is the key is rules. I mean, you can set up an independent commission, you can have legislative staff do it, but the key is you want to have whoever's drawing the maps bound as much as possible by rules that stop the mischief from taking place. And one of them that's very important is not take any account of incumbent. Don't take any account of the way people have voted in the past, the partisan affiliation. You put really good rules in place, and you convince people that, hey, these rules will stop the gerrymandering from taking place. That seems to be something that will convince them. Base it on rules, more so on who's actually drawing it, because one of the key objections, and I talk to Republican legislators a lot, because we're talking to them about other things. If redistricting ever comes up, they don't want to come up because they don't want to change it. But if it ever comes up, they always say, well, it's always going to be political. It's a political process. You can't take the politics out of it. Why pretend? Well, if you have rules in place, that at least limits the likelihood that the political role is played. And in our bill, it would be the leaders of the two chambers, both Republican and Democratic, would appoint one member each to a commission, and then those 4 members would appoint the 5th member, who would be the chair. So yes, politics is involved at the very start when they put the members on the commission. But if you have good rules in place, that'll help to limit the amount of mischief that you do.
Yeah, if I can just add 3 other quick things to that. One of the reasons why incumbency didn't work very well in the messaging was that people thought it's not just incumbents, it's any politician. And when we asked people, how long does it take for a politician to acquire the attitude of an incumbent, people said on average 6 months. There were plenty of people that thought it would be like 6 weeks. The other thing that was interesting is, and it's a really great point that you're making, the language of, we did the polling for redistricting, the redistricting effort in Florida, and rules or principles, people thought, particularly principles, people thought, yeah, basic principles in charge. The other thing is, as we know in Ohio, redistricting got defeated because the other side went after the so-called independent commission, and people, it didn't take very long, and to your point exactly, like, okay, who the hell's appointing this independent, so-called independent commission? And they just think it's impossible to keep the people on there completely independent. You can also have rules that test quite well, like you can't have a retired politician on there or things like that, and those kinds of rules test very well as well.
What was that again?
One of the interesting things about what we had just here is this discussion of how the votes compared to the seats that you were going through. Tells you something about every analysis that we've heard today. And that is, what we're overlooking is the fact that the way you draw the districts not only affects how the votes are distributed among those districts, it affects the votes. And all of the analysis we heard today was confused, in a sense, between the playing field and what resulted from the team's efforts on that field.
That's a great point.
And you need to make that distinction. And none of the data we listened today, including your accurate analysis at the end there, takes that into account.
I'm curious, the median age of the United States population is 38. I'd like a show of hands for how many people are below the median age in this room.
Yeah.
Good. I thanks to Linda for showing that one visual. And I'm coming from a geographic and visual storytelling background, and I would be curious to know the percentage of images that we saw on slides in the last 2 days that would make a resonant image on a device like this. That I think a lot of the half of the population that are looking, that are below the median age, and not just on phones, but I'm here to make a case for more. I think that the messaging, the stories are important, but in an age of more limited attention spans perhaps, and media that don't involve, we've heard fantastic oral arguments here from folks who are used to oral arguments, but I think there's a real gap and a need for visual storytelling, and I'd be curious to hear what folks have to say about that.
Well, I agree completely, and the only thing that I would add is that the average 30-second soundbite is now 9 seconds. So reinforcing the power of an image, but.
Sure, I think that's exactly right. I mean,
There you go.
I took, I was interviewed for a video that Fusion did on gerrymandering, which some people are nodding their heads over. And when I started watching it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is kind of frightening. It is this super young guy walking down the street really fast, waving his hands around, crazy talking about gerrymandering. I'm like, this isn't going to go well. And I was sort of the old straight guy, because in the thing, you know, as the person trying to explain it, and then everything around it was not presented in the way that I was presenting it. And I'm like, no one is going to watch this, but it blew up, and I've had more people mention that to me than anything else. About a week later was when Arnold Schwarzenegger did his video for the attention site that compared the popularity of Congress with herpes, and I think Nickelback as well, and then got into a Twitter war with Nickelback. What's less popular, Nickelback or herpes? Herpes won. So there are clever and interesting ways of doing this that, you know, embrace different kinds of storytelling techniques, that embrace the way people get information, that embrace, you know, social media, and that are clicky and shareable and fun and informative.
Question ever here from a younger person.
Hi, I'm a Duke student. This question is for Mitch. So I'm trying to think of a way to market the message of redistricting to the population of Duke students, right? Which for a lot of kids, and well, you talked about the elite and their drawing the districts to benefit them and all those things. A lot of Duke students, and I know the elite politicians are different than like the population of elite Americans, but a lot of Duke students are those elite Americans, like they're used to that kind of like behavior in a way, and a lot of kids, like relatedly, are disconnected from the political process in general. I'm just trying to, yeah, maybe you can help me with this, like grapple with a way to get those audiences to care.
It's going to be hard to get those audiences to care if they're not engaged in politics, but I think perhaps I use the word elite, but in the case of them, fat cats. I mean, it's the same type of argument that Bernie Sanders made to students, you know, the rich guys, the people with the power, they're holding on to that power in illegitimate ways. They're using it to hurt normal, average folks. And I think a lot of people on your campus could relate to that. You wouldn't have to use the word elite, and perhaps on a campus like Duke, it might not be good to use the word elite. But said as the Carolina grad. But yeah, there are ways to get that message.
You know, the other thing that tested well, two other things, and it goes back to your incumbent point. While the negative of incumbent didn't test very well, the positive of new leaders tested very well, and I think millennials would like that as well. And then, you know, when to your point, the average age in the United States is 38, the average age of politicians is like 58. So one of the things, I mean, we've done some work on how to get more women in office and people of color. Actually adding young people to that dramatically increased the power of those arguments with older and younger voters. So people that weren't actually that interested in electing more women and people of color were quite interested in electing more young people to office.
I think it's very positive that we have both someone from the right end of the spectrum on the libertarian side, as well as a lot of the rest of us from the progressive side. And I think the messaging that we've seen over the last, going back 10 years or so, some of the most effective messaging we've seen are, on the one hand, from the Tea Party, on the other hand, from the Occupy movement.
Yeah.
These were There's some argument about just how grassroots the Tea Party actually was, but there's plenty of evidence that was very much grassroots movement, and of course Occupy came out of nowhere. Occupy didn't have any clear demands, and it was very hard to get. I happened to be in New York City at that time, and I remember saying, oh my gosh, look at all this energy, all we have to do now is vote. But none of them were interested in that in the slightest, but they were interested in participation. And the one thing I see as consistent between these two messages is that the government is no longer under our control. The government is out of control. It doesn't represent us. So I wonder if you could comment on the possible intersection of messaging between Occupy and the Tea Party.
I do think you hit on exactly one place where those groups intersect. I mean, Tea Party and Occupy were different groups, but some people were brought to those causes for similar reasons. Just look at and say, things aren't working the way they should be. The people who are working hard, putting forth the effort, aren't getting ahead. And the people who already have power, whether it's you're complaining about the government, or you're complaining about business, or other parts of society, it seems as if the deck is stacked against them. And the whole idea of gerrymandering and redistricting reform fits in with that process generally.
We've got about 2 minutes left, I think.
So I was going to ask a question related to that. So we heard about the messaging that works, so votes matter, the fox in the hen house. My question was going to be to Mitch just about, and it's open to anybody, about any more North Carolina, specific examples of, things we could say in that way, or also just any resources that we can look to, whether that's active groups, just information that we can package that.
In terms of resources, I would point to Bob's organization that is leading the North Carolina Coalition for Lobbying and Government Reform, and your website is?
Well, there's commoncallsnc.org and ingerrymanderingnow.org.
InGerrymanderingNow.org is their specific gerrymandering site where they gathered a bunch of information on that. The messaging for North Carolina is tough in terms of actually convincing the people who are in a position now to make the change, because there is one chamber of our General Assembly that is basically dead set against it, and that's because they kind of run their chamber the same way that it was run when the other party ran it, and that is, we like the power, we're going to keep the power, we don't want to change anything. There is some interest within the other chamber, this being the House, and in fact, I'm sure you all have heard that we have a redistricting reform bill filed in a Republican-controlled House by Republican representatives, and that is the only place where redistricting reform has gotten through our chamber in the past, was in the North Carolina House. And so I think the messages of basically the ones that Celinda was talking about. This is a way to restore the American system as it was designed. Conservatives are all about talking about the founders and the Constitution and following what was the original design of our constitutional system of checks and balances and separate branches. I mean, if you believe in those issues, then you have to believe in the core principle of popular sovereignty, and that is based on voters choosing their representatives, not representatives choosing their voters. And there are plenty of examples that you can point to on from both parties of ways in which the people in charge actually drew things in such a way to help themselves and to hurt the other party. Just in Congress the last two times around, when the Democrats drew districts the last time around after the 2000s, a state senator from Wake County, who was the chairman of the state Senate's redistricting committee, drew a congressional district so that he could win it, and he did win it. 10 years later, he had poetic justice because Republicans were in charge, and they drew that same district so he couldn't win it. They stuck him into a district with another Democratic incumbent. But at the same time, they also drew a district so that one of their buddies in the state senate could win. And he didn't win the first time around, but he did the second time around. So there are plenty of examples you could point to, actual ways in which politicians in both parties have drawn districts directly to benefit either themselves or their friends.
Do we have any more time? Mr. Good.
I have a question that's based on the idea that epistemology and ontology have undergone a radical transformation in the last few months. What constitutes reality and how we learn about it is what I'm talking about. So that we now have a world with notions like false facts and fake news and this sort of thing. Now what I'd like to do is find out whether there's any way of estimating what kind of polling data you would get if you reran your study. And one of the pieces of reality that I have right now is the study by FOA and Monk using world data on the numbers of people, the proportion of people who support the idea that it's essential to live in a country that's governed by democracy. What you find, this was published in January in the Journal of Democracy, what you find, what they report is that in the United States, people born in the age cohort of the 1980s, fewer than 30%, or excuse me, around 30%, believe that it's essential to live in a country that's governed by a democracy. This is in contrast to their grandparents born in the 30s, who in the United States believe at the rate of about 60% that it's essential to live in a democracy. It was even higher at that time in that age group in Europe. So do you have any idea what the actual reality is now in terms of telling us what our messaging should be after these astounding, unimaginable transformations?
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, there's a lot of things going on. One thing that's going on is people are very polarized, and the Trump voters are still solidly in favor of their person, including Trump-Obama voters. You have a situation where people think things are going in the wrong direction, although the State of the Union did make people significantly more optimistic. Unclear what is happening now with the Russian session stuff. You have a situation where people are paying more attention than they have ever paid before. So you really have the ability to have a conversation. And in general, you see a decline in terms of politicians. A feeling that state legislatures' numbers tend to be down, politicians' numbers tend to be down. So I would say two things. I think if you put all of that together, probably the same messages would test only even stronger. Secondly, this notion of not putting the politicians in charge, or elections are the one day where we get to have our say, would be very strong. There was some rise in concern about fraud around elections, which is another common cause meeting, I think, among Trump voters post the election. That's receded a bit. I think it would depend on what Trump says. But the other thing I would say is that people, people want change. I mean, it's the number one reason that Donald Trump got elected, and the most positive thing that people think about him now is that he has very rapidly changed things. And so I think the change, if there's anything that's probably shifted a little bit in the data, I think everything would be stronger, except maybe even more in terms of messages that talk about change. By the way, one thing I would add, and I just want to underscore what you were saying, is that the reason I didn't break this data out by party is that exactly what you hypothesized. These messages are very, very strong across party lines. There are almost no discernible difference in terms of the support, and even stronger with independents who feel screwed by everybody.
Great discussion, and you beat me to the points, but join me once again in thanking our great guests.
Hi, I realize that I'm standing between you, lunch, and going home, so let me make this quick. I want to thank a number of people before we let out. This has been a tremendous conversation between a lot of different groups of people, right? It's the litigators, it's the lawyers, it's the social scientists, it's the mathematicians, it's the physical scientists, it's the people, right, who on a daily basis, when you go back home to the states that you hail from, are going to take up the mantle to talk about what's fair and what's right for America. And so I want to thank you all for coming to this conversation. I want to in particular thank our co-hosts, Campaign Legal Center, with the Fancy Club. I want to thank Duke University, Sanford School of Public Policy, and the POLIS Center. And there's a number of individuals who've been running around. Various of us are waking up 3 a.m. West Coast time. And I just want to give a quick shout out to them. I don't know if they're in the room. Christina Monroe, Dan Acuna, over here. Keisha Harris. So thank you. So one of the things that people have asked is how do we stay in touch? And so I think what we might expect is we will try to take the list of folks who have expressed interest in both attending, but also maybe they couldn't come, and try to create a listserv with your permission to allow for some conversations. We've got to figure out a way to keep this conversation going, but I think it's very important for us to be able to share as much as possible. Now, you all know this has been live streamed throughout the last 2 days. That same site will now have the video from from both days' sessions. We will also be working to get the PowerPoints from the various presenters because folks asked it. And also, I think, contacts of the various speakers with their permission, because I know a lot of you want to recreate some version of this conversation in your state, in your town, in your city. And so one way to do that is to be able to tap into the people who you've heard from today. And with that, I just want to thank you. Please keep the conversations going, keep the energy alive. All change is possible when we, the people, put our heads and minds and hearts together. Thank you.